The letter arrived before Rufus Bellamy even had the decency to wait for his brother's body to go cold. Nora was still wearing black when the envelope appeared under her door. No knock, no name, just the wax seal of a man who'd spent years watching what his brother had built and deciding it should have been his. Inside, 3 sentences. The first said her husband's funeral had been paid for out of Rufus's own pocket. The second said she owed him. The third said he had already filed paperwork with the county court claiming she was unfit to raise a child alone. Her daughter Elsie was 11 weeks old. If you've ever held something precious and felt someone else's hands reaching for it, you already know what Nora felt when she read that letter. And if you've never had to choose between staying and fighting or running and surviving, count yourself among the lucky ones. Because Nora had maybe 4 days before Rufus's men would come to her door with a judge's signature. She packed what she could carry. She picked up her daughter, and she ran. Before we go any further, if stories like this one move something in you, if you've ever rooted for someone who had nothing left but grit, I want to invite you to subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that notification bell so you never miss what comes next. And when you're done watching, drop a comment and tell me the name of your city or country. I want to see how far this story travels. Every single comment means the world. Now, let's go back to Montana, 1886. And meet the man who was about to open his door and change everything. Silas Renford hadn't planned to be outside that evening. He'd been meaning to check the fence line on the north pasture since Tuesday and kept putting it off because some part of him had stopped seeing much point in urgency. The ranch ran, the cattle stayed alive. The seasons turned without caring whether he watched them or not. That had been enough for 3 years, just enough, barely enough, and he'd gotten used to calling it a life. But the storm that rolled in off the mountains that October afternoon was the kind that announced itself with a smell before the sky even changed color. Something mineral and electric, the scent of water falling somewhere far away and coming fast. Silas had grown up reading that smell. His father had taught him that, back when learning things from his father had still been possible. He pulled on his coat, not because he felt like it, but because the cattle were restless, and restless cattle could do damage that cost money. He didn't have room to lose. He went out through the back, crossed the yard to check the gate on the east pen, and that was when he happened to look down the road. At first he thought it was a deer. The shape was moving wrong for a person, hunched and lurching, tilted hard to one side, fighting something invisible. The rain had started by then, not the gentle kind, but the punishing kind that comes in sideways and finds every gap in your clothing. Whatever was out there on that road was already soaked through. He stood at the fence post and watched for a moment longer than he should have. Later, he would wonder about that pause. Would wonder what it meant that his first instinct wasn't to go help, but to stand still and observe, the way a man does when he's spent long enough alone that other people start to feel like weather, something to wait out rather than walk toward. Then the shape stumbled. Not a trip, not a slip on the mud, a full, hard stumble that nearly brought whoever it was down to their knees. And in the half-second before they caught themselves, Silas heard something that cut straight through the sound of rain and wind. A baby crying. He was over the fence before he'd made a conscious decision to move. She heard him coming and spun around so fast she nearly lost her balance again. Her free arm came up in a posture that wasn't quite a fist, but wasn't nothing either. A gesture Silas had seen on cornered animals and people who'd been given reasons not to trust sudden movement. Her other arm was locked around something wrapped in a wool blanket pressed flat against her chest, and whatever was inside that blanket was screaming. "Easy," Silas said. He kept his hands visible and slowed to a walk. I live here. That's my land back there. I saw you from the fence." She stared at him. Her hair was plastered flat against her face. She was younger than he'd expected, maybe mid-20s. With eyes that had gone sharp and hard in the way eyes go when a person has been frightened for so long that fear becomes a kind of armor. She was wearing a traveling coat that might have been decent quality 6 months ago. Now it was soaked through and streaked with road mud up past the hem. "I'm fine," she said. The baby was still crying. "You're standing in the middle of a flooding road in the dark," Silas said. Not unkindly, just factually. "Where are you trying to get to?" Something crossed her face. Not quite shame, not quite exhaustion, but something between the two. She looked down the road ahead of her, then back at him, then at the road again, as though she was calculating whether there was any version of this conversation that didn't end with her needing something from a stranger. "Red Willow," she said. "Red Willow is 7 miles east. The creek crossing's flooded. Has been since this morning." She went very still. The baby's crying had dropped to a desperate, hiccuping kind of whimper. The sound of a child who'd been crying so long they were starting to run out of the energy for it. "May we sleep in your barn?" she asked. She didn't look at him when she said it. She looked past him, toward the lights of his house visible through the rain. Her jaw was set in a way that told him the question had cost her something to ask, that she'd turned over every other option first and found them all closed. "No," Silas said. Her chin came up fast. "My barn's cold," he said. "Come inside." "What?" She didn't say thank you. He noticed that. Most people, handed an unexpected kindness, fill the space with gratitude or apology or some combination of the two. She did neither. She walked beside him across his yard with her shoulders straight and her grip tight on the baby, and when he held the door open, she walked through it without meeting his eyes. He respected that, though he couldn't have said exactly why. Inside, she stood in the middle of his front room and looked around in one slow sweep. He tried to see it the way she was seeing it, a man's house, clearly, functional and joyless. A table with one chair, a hearth that needed sweeping, walls with nothing on them except a calendar from 1884 and a rifle he kept meaning to rehang somewhere else. The kind of house that said plainly, "Nobody here expects company." "I'm Silas Renford," he said. "Nora Bellamy." She'd started unwrapping the blanket from around the baby, checking the child with fast, practiced hands, the way a mother does when she's been afraid for a while and checking is the only thing that makes her feel like she's doing something useful. "And this is Elsie." Elsie was red-faced and damp and furious. She had the look of a baby who'd been outside too long and wanted everyone to understand exactly how she felt about that. When Nora settled her closer and started rocking slightly on her feet, the fury downgraded to indignation and then to a series of short, pointed complaints. Silas built the fire up higher and didn't ask questions. He found 2 extra blankets in the chest by the window. They smelled like cedar and disuse, like everything else in this house, and brought them out. He put a pot of water on. He moved around his own kitchen with the particular efficiency of a man who has lived alone long enough, that the ritual of it has become second nature, filling space with task, because task is easier than conversation. Nora watched him for a while. Then she said, "I can work for the nights I stay." "You don't need to do that." "I'm not saying I need to. I'm saying I will." He looked at her. She looked back. The fire had started to do its job and some of the sharp, cold edge had left her face. But the set of her jaw was still the same. That careful, deliberate steadiness of a person who has made a decision not to be seen as helpless and is committed to it regardless of cost. "All right," Silas said. He pulled the second chair out from where it had been sitting against the wall, gathering dust, and set it by the table. Neither of them remarked on that. The trouble started in the middle of the night. Silas had given Nora the only bedroom and had settled himself by the fire with a blanket and his boots still on, the way he used to sleep during calving season when he had a reason to stay half awake. He wasn't actually sleeping. He'd found years ago that real sleep, the deep, uninterrupted kind, had become something that happened to him occasionally rather than something he could arrange. He heard the change in Elsie's crying around 2 in the morning. Before, the baby had made noise the way babies do, insistently, cyclically, with breaks and patterns that suggested the crying was about hunger or discomfort or the general injustice of being 4 months old in a cold world. This was different. This was thin and high and continuous, the kind of sound that is not about want, but about something wrong. He was at the bedroom door before Nora called for him. She had the baby laid across her knees and her palm pressed to Elsie's forehead. In the lamplight, her face was stripped of all the careful composure she'd maintained since he first found her on the road. What he saw underneath was not weakness. It was something closer to terror being held at arm's length by sheer force of will. "She's burning up," Nora said. Her voice was steady. Her hands were not. Silas didn't waste time with words. He went for the water, for the cloths, for the things you do when a fever comes in the night, and you are far from any doctor, and the only thing standing between a sick child and whatever comes next is a cold compress and someone who refuses to leave. He brought the basin in. He set it on the floor beside where Nora sat. Then he pulled up the chest at the foot of the bed and sat on it, because it was clear she was not going to sleep. And it seemed wrong, somehow, to leave her alone in a strange room with a sick baby and no one to hand her things. "Has she been sick before?" he asked. "A cold in September, nothing like this. Babies run high fevers and come through them. It doesn't always mean what it feels like it means." She looked at him. "You sound like you know." He didn't answer that. He handed her a fresh cloth and looked at the far wall instead. They sat like that for most of what remained of the night. Nora cooling Elsie's skin, rocking her, speaking to her in a low voice that Silas didn't try to hear clearly because it wasn't meant for him. Silas keeping the water cold, keeping the lamp filled, getting up twice to add wood to the fire down the hall so the house stayed warm. There was nothing romantic about any of it. There was nothing even particularly comfortable. It was just two people in a small room doing the only thing available to them, which was refuse to stop trying. At some point around 4 in the morning, Elsie's breathing changed, slower, easier. The fever heat beginning, just barely, to back off the way a flood begins to recede. Not gone yet, not safe yet, but the direction of things shifting. Nora let out a breath that sounded like she'd been holding it for hours. She probably had. Silas made coffee at first light and left a cup outside the bedroom door. When he came back in from the morning chores an hour later, Nora was in his kitchen, still wearing yesterday's clothes, her hair tied back with a piece of string that looked like it had been repurposed from something else. She had found the sack of flour he kept in the lower cabinet and was making biscuits on the cleared section of counter, working the dough with the absent efficiency of a woman who has done it 1,000 times and doesn't need to think about it. Elsie was lying in a nest of folded blankets on the floor nearby, awake and no longer screaming. She was staring at the ceiling with the focused, philosophical expression that very young babies sometimes wear, as though the world is a puzzle they are working through and haven't gotten frustrated yet. "You didn't have to do that," Silas said. "I told you I'd work." Nora didn't look up from the dough. "Flour was low. You've got weevils in the second bag. Throw it out." Silas looked at the second flour bag sitting in the corner. He had noticed the weevils, actually, a few weeks ago. He'd been meaning to deal with it. "I'll add flour to the supply list," he said. "You should add lard, salt pork, and dried beans, too. And whatever you use for the cattle through winter, I don't know your setup, but your grain bin's only half full, and it's October." He stood in the doorway of his own kitchen and looked at this woman who had arrived at his door half-drowned and terrified less than 12 hours ago and was now inventorying his provisions with the brisk competence of someone who has discovered a problem and finds the problem more interesting than the fear. "How's Elsie?" he finally asked. Something in Nora's shoulders changed. Not dramatically. Just a small release of something she'd been carrying. "Cooler," she said. "She kept water down this morning. I think she's past the worst of it." A pause. "She needs another day or two before I move her." "Then stay." Nora set the biscuits in the pan. She still hadn't looked at him. "I don't want to be a burden." "You're making biscuits," Silas said. "That's not what a burden looks like." Elsie made a sound from her blanket nest on the floor. Something between a coo and a complaint. The noise of a baby announcing her presence to anyone who might have forgotten about her. Silas looked down at her. Elsie looked up at him with dark, unfocused eyes that somehow managed to convey both complete dependency and absolute dignity. He hadn't been this close to an infant in 3 years. He hadn't let himself be. He crouched down without thinking about it and held out his index finger. Elsie grabbed it with a grip that was entirely out of proportion to how small her hand was. She held on with the seriousness of someone who had decided this was important, and Silas felt something shift in his chest. Not break, not shatter, nothing so violent. Just shift, like a door that has been stuck for a long time moving an inch on its hinges. He stood back up and went to hang his coat. Behind him, he heard Nora slide the biscuits into the oven. And though he couldn't see her face, he wasn't sure, but he thought that she might have been watching. Well, the biscuits were good, better than anything he'd made himself in recent memory, which wasn't saying much since his standard for acceptable cooking had drifted low enough that he'd been eating salt pork and day-old cornbread most nights without caring enough to improve. They ate across from each other at the table, so he'd pulled the second chair back out without ceremony. And the awkwardness of two strangers sharing a meal in a quiet house was present but not unbearable. Elsie dozed in her nest by the fire. "Where were you headed?" Silas asked. "After Red Willow." Nora considered the question for slightly longer than it seemed to warrant. West, she said. Oregon, maybe. I've heard there's work for women who can run a household. Domestic work? If that's what's available. And you've got family there? Someone expecting you? No? The single word sat on the table between them. She offered nothing else, and he didn't push. He'd heard enough of that word, spoken in that particular tone, short and final, and carrying the weight of more than it said, to know that pushing would get him nowhere useful. He refilled her coffee cup without asking. She looked at the cup, then at him, and something in her expression was close to surprise, as if small kindnesses still caught her off guard. It occurred to him that might be a recently acquired quality, that there might have been a time, not so long ago, when she expected them. "You've been running for a while," he said. Not a question. She wrapped both hands around the cup. Outside, the storm was still going, rain against the window making the inside feel more enclosed, more separate from the world than it usually did. Silas found he didn't mind that. "I've been making decisions quickly," she said carefully. "There's a difference." "Sure," he said. "If you say so." For a moment he thought he'd pushed something wrong. Then the corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile, just the ghost of the architecture of one, and she looked down at her coffee. "It's a small difference," she admitted. Silas nodded. He reached for another biscuit and said nothing else. Some conversations are held together by silence as much as by words, and he'd learned enough loneliness to know when not to fill space. The days that followed happened the way early things happen. Slowly at first, then all at once. Nora stayed because Elsie needed to recover. Then she stayed because the storm didn't break. Then she stayed because she'd found his account ledger by accident while looking for something to write a shopping list on, and what she saw in it stopped her cold. "You're losing money on the Henderson contract," she said one afternoon, setting the ledger on the table in front of him without preamble. She'd been there 4 days by then, and the careful formality of the first morning had worn down to something more like the directness of people who've shared enough inconvenience to stop performing. Silas looked at the page she was pointing at. "I know. The rate you agreed to doesn't account for winter feed costs. You'll come up short before February. I've been meaning to renegotiate." "When?" He didn't answer. She sat down across from him. She had Elsie in the crook of one arm in that effortless way mothers carry their children. When carrying has become so habitual, the body just incorporates it. "You've got 3 separate accounts with 2 different suppliers, and you're paying service fees on both. You could consolidate. You'd save almost $40 a year." Silas looked at her for a moment. "You do this often? Walk into men's houses and start fixing their finances?" "I do it when the numbers are wrong and someone needs to hear it." She didn't flinch. "My husband ran his family's tobacco operation for 6 years. I kept the books for 4 of them. Not because anyone asked me to, because someone had to, and I was the only one who could actually see where the money was bleeding." It was the first time she'd mentioned her husband directly. Silas caught the past tense but didn't remark on it. "How long ago?" he asked. 6 months. Simple. Clean. The kind of answer that has been repeated enough times that the speaker has learned to say it without letting it undo them. "I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry. Just fix the Henderson contract before December." She handed him the ledger back and went to check on Elsie's blanket, and Silas sat at the table and looked at the numbers she'd pointed out. Numbers he'd been ignoring for weeks because looking at them required a kind of forward-thinking energy he hadn't been able to locate, and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Useful. He felt potentially useful again, if he could bring himself to be. Which was, he was slowly beginning to understand, at least part of what she was doing. On the 5th evening, he came in from the barn later than usual because one of the mares had been restless, and he'd stayed until she settled. The house was lit when he came through the back, properly lit, 3 lamps instead of his usual one, and there was something cooking on the stove that smelled like actual food, the kind that has been tended and thought about rather than just heated until edible. He stood in the doorway and looked at his own kitchen. The table had been pushed slightly, giving more room around the stove. The counter had been reorganized in a way that made logical sense if you were right-handed and working efficiently, which he was and had never thought to arrange for. The weevil bag was gone. Elsie was in the corner in a sling Nora had constructed from one of the extra blankets, dozing. It looked, Silas thought, like a room where someone lived. Not survived. Lived. He sat down and ate the meal she put in front of him, and they talked about the ranch, the cattle count, the feed situation, whether the north pasture fence would hold the winter. And it was the most sustained conversation he'd had with another human being since the previous spring, when the traveling merchant had stopped to sell him supplies and stayed long enough for coffee. He went to bed that night and stared at the ceiling and understood, with the mild alarm of a man who has been ambushed by something he should have seen coming, that the house had stopped feeling empty. He didn't know what to do with that. He suspected she didn't either, but she was still there in the morning when he woke up. And Elsie was still there, and the second chair was still at the table, as though returning it to the wall would require an acknowledgement that neither of them were quite ready to make. So it stayed, and so did she. For now. The second chair stayed at the table. Silas hadn't moved it back to the wall, and Nora hadn't asked him to. That was the unspoken agreement of the first week. Neither of them acknowledged the small changes accumulating in the house, because acknowledging them would have required a conversation neither of them was ready to have. The chair stayed. The extra lamp stayed lit in the evenings. Elsie's makeshift sling hung on the peg by the back door next to Silas's coat, the wool blanket and the oilskin occupying the same space as though they'd always belonged there. It was the kind of thing you didn't notice until you did, and then you couldn't stop noticing it. Nora noticed it on the 8th morning. She was standing at the counter with her back to the room, grinding coffee beans with the hand mill she'd found in the back of a cabinet, and she heard Silas come in from the barn and hang his coat, and she heard the particular sound his boots made on the floorboards, that slightly uneven rhythm, right heel hitting harder than the left, something she'd learned without meaning to, and she realized she'd been listening for it. Not waiting. Listening. There was a difference, she told herself. She wasn't waiting for anything. She ground the beans harder than necessary. "You're going to powder those," Silas said behind her. "I know how to grind coffee." "You're grinding it like it did something to you personally." She set the mill down. "Do you want coffee or commentary?" "Both, if I'm honest." She turned around and he was already at the table, pulling off his gloves, the cold still coming off him in that particular way it does when someone's been outside for hours in October air. There was mud on his left boot up to the ankle. His hair was doing the thing it did in the mornings, sticking up on one side in a way that she suspected he didn't know about, and that she had decided firmly and deliberately was not her concern. "The gray mare," he said before she could ask. "She foaled." "I thought you said she wasn't due until November." "She wasn't. The foal came anyway." He rubbed the back of his neck. "Small. Came out wrong end first. Took 3 hours." "Is it alive?" "She is, yeah." Something in his face changed on the she, a small softening, brief and almost invisible. Stubborn little thing fought her way through it. Nora poured the coffee and set his cup in front of him. She thought about asking more. She thought about saying something about stubbornness being an underrated quality. She thought about a lot of things and said none of them, and instead went back to the counter to check the biscuit dough she'd started before he came in. Elsie was awake in her corner, doing what she'd started doing in the past few days, tracking movement with her eyes, turning her head toward voices, discovering that the world extended beyond her own immediate needs into the interesting territory of other people's business. She had fixed her gaze on Silas with the focused intensity she applied to anything that caught her attention. Silas looked back at her over his coffee cup. "Morning," he said to her, flat, unperformed, the way you'd greet someone in passing. Elsie's face arranged itself into something that wasn't quite a smile yet, more the precursor to one, the muscular memory of an expression still being learned, and made a sound that fell somewhere between a sigh and a declaration. Silas's mouth did something complicated. He looked away before it resolved into anything specific, took a drink of his coffee, and stared at the middle distance like a man watching something in the yard that only he could see. Nora busied herself with the biscuits and didn't remark on any of it. She'd been watching the road since day 3, which was 2 days after Elsie's fever broke and the creek crossing reopened. She'd told herself the first day she was just observing the weather. The second day she told herself she was planning her departure. By the 4th and 5th and 6th days, she'd stopped telling herself anything and just watched, standing at the window in the early mornings before Silas came in, letting herself see what was there. Nothing was ever there. Just the road, churned up from the storm, rutted and slow-drying. Occasionally a wagon in the distance. Once 2 riders who turned north before they reached the property. She watched anyway. The fear had not diminished. It had just changed shape. When she'd been walking with Elsie in the rain, the fear had been immediate and physical. The way cold is immediate, the way a stumble is immediate. No room for anything except the next step and the next. Now that she had walls and heat and food, the fear had become something she could think about, which meant it was also something she couldn't stop thinking about. Rufus knew she'd gone west. She'd covered her tracks as well as she could, paying cash in Lexington, using her mother's maiden name at the boarding house in Cincinnati. But Rufus was not a stupid man. He was a patient, methodical, deeply unpleasant man who had spent his entire adult life taking things that belonged to other people through legal mechanisms and waiting smiles, and he would not have let her run without sending someone to find out where she'd gone. The only question was how much time she had. It was this calculation, not comfort, not anything as uncomplicated as comfort, that kept her in Silas Renford's house, past the point where Elsie's recovery could reasonably justify it. She wasn't hiding. She was buying time to think. There was a difference, she told herself again. She was aware that she was doing a lot of telling herself things. On the 9th morning, while Silas was in the barn and Elsie was sleeping, Nora sat down at the table with the ranch ledger open in front of her. Not because she needed to look at it again, she already had the numbers in her head, but because looking at a problem on paper made the other problems feel more manageable. If she could fix the Henderson contract numbers, she could not fix her own numbers. Or something like that. The logic didn't entirely hold, but the activity helped. She was cross-referencing 2 of the supplier invoices when she found the other ledger. It was tucked inside the back cover of the main one. A smaller book, older, the spine cracked and the cover warped from moisture at some point years back. She didn't open it immediately. She sat with it in her hands for a moment, knowing from its age and its separateness that it belonged to some other part of Silas's life. The part he kept in the back of books, and the unused chair against the wall, and the cradle in the far corner of the bedroom that she'd noticed on the first night and carefully not mentioned. She put it back where she found it. She went back to the invoices. She kept the questions to herself, but the cradle sat in her mind for the rest of the morning. She'd seen it in the lamplight that first night when she was caring for Elsie, and her eyes had moved around the room the way frightened eyes do, cataloging exits and details without meaning to. It was a good cradle, handmade, clearly. The joinery too careful and too personal for something bought. Sanded, smooth, and solidly built. The kind of thing a man makes when he has something specific in mind, when the object in his hands has a face in his imagination. Empty. Dusty around the base where a broom missed it. Positioned in the corner, not like something stored, but like something left. The distinction being that stored things are put somewhere out of the way, while left things are just wherever they were when you stopped being able to move them. She hadn't asked. She would not ask. Some doors you leave closed, not because you're incurious, but because you understand that the person on the other side of them gets to decide when they open. It was Elsie who broke the careful distance first, in the way that babies break things, without strategy or awareness, through the pure physics of being small and needing and impossible to ignore. She'd started crying on the 12th evening at a pitch that was not hunger, not discomfort, not fever, just the existential protest cry of a baby who has decided, for reasons available only to her, that right now is not a time she wishes to be put down. Nora had been on her feet with her for 40 minutes, walking the length of the front room and back, and Elsie had escalated rather than improved, screwing her face into an expression of profound betrayal every time Nora tried to settle her. Silas appeared in the doorway from the kitchen, where he'd been repairing a piece of tack. He looked at Nora. He looked at Elsie. "May I?" he said. Nora stopped walking. "She won't stop for a stranger." "Maybe." He said it without arguing, just stood there with his hands loose at his sides, waiting. Nora looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at her screaming daughter. Then she crossed the room and put Elsie in his arms, mostly because she'd run out of other options, and her own arms were about to give out. Silas held Elsie the way men hold babies who have held babies before. Not gingerly, not with that stiff-armed performance of someone terrified of doing it wrong, but with a settled solidity, the baby's weight distributed and absorbed into a posture that said, "I've got you," and meant it. He started walking, not Nora's tight back and forth, but a longer, slower, irregular circuit of the room, pausing briefly at the window, at the far wall, at the hearth, as if he were giving Elsie something new to look at with each stop. Within 4 minutes, Elsie was quiet. Within 7, she was asleep, her face mashed against Silas's shoulder with the complete surrender that babies reserve for moments when they've decided, for reasons unknown, that they are safe. Nora stood in the middle of the room and felt something tighten in her throat that she refused to let travel further. "How did you do that?" she asked. Silas looked at the sleeping baby against his shoulder. His face in that moment was something she had not seen on it before. Not the bluntness, not the careful neutrality, not the particular expression of a man performing the role of not being bothered. Something more exposed. Something she recognized because she had felt its shape in herself and knew what it cost to keep it from showing. "I don't know," he said. "Some of it's just walking." He kept walking until he was sure Elsie was deeply enough asleep to survive the transfer. Then he carried her to the bedroom and laid her down in the center of the bed. And Nora followed and watched from the doorway, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then Silas stepped back toward the door and stopped when he reached her, close enough that she could see the exhaustion in the lines of his face and the specific kind of care he was taking not to look at the corner of the room. She looked where he wasn't looking. The cradle. "Silas," she said quietly. Not the beginning of a question, just his name, which sometimes is enough. He shook his head once, not dismissively, more like a man declining an offer he knows is genuine but can't accept yet. "Not tonight," he said. She stepped out of the doorway to let him through, and he went back to the kitchen and his tack repair, and she listened to the sound of him working while she sat with her sleeping daughter and understood, not everything, but enough. That the man in the next room had been very hurt by something he had not chosen and had been alone with it for a long time. She understood that because she knew what that felt like from the inside, and she thought that maybe that was why, in spite of every practical reason to keep moving, she was still here. Not because she was hiding, not entirely, but because sometimes you recognize a shape of loss in another person and it steadies your own somehow, just by being visible. She told him about Rufus 12 days after she'd arrived. She hadn't planned to. She'd been planning, in fact, to leave that morning. The road was clear, Elsie was well, and she'd spent the previous night listing every logical reason why staying longer was a risk she couldn't afford. The list was solid. She'd gone to sleep feeling decided. Then she'd woken up at 5 and gone to the window and stood there and felt the specific, cold, familiar weight of a person who has no place to go settling itself back into her chest, and the decision had dissolved before she'd had a single cup of coffee. She told him at breakfast. Without preamble, because she'd learned in 12 days that Silas Renford didn't need preamble and tended to trust people less when they used too much of it. She told him about her husband's death in March, about the farm in Kentucky, 300 acres of good land that her husband's family had worked for 40 years, and that his father had left specifically and legally to his son, and through his son to his son's heirs. About Rufus, the younger brother, who had spent a decade being resentful and a week after the funeral being dangerous. She told him about the letter under the door, about the petition, about the word unfit, and what it meant when applied to a mother in a Kentucky courtroom where her husband's brother had more friends than she did and more money than she could spend in a year. She told him she had paid for the lawyer herself, sold her mother's necklace to do it, and been advised that the petition was thin, but that thin wasn't the same as harmless, and that if she went before that judge before the paperwork was sorted, she might lose Elsie on a procedural technicality while the actual case was still pending. So she ran. Silas listened to all of it without interrupting. His coffee went cold in front of him. When she finished, he was quiet for long enough that she started to wonder if she'd misjudged him. If the man she'd been reading across a breakfast table for 12 days was not who she'd thought. If this was the moment his expression would reorganize itself into something more careful, more distant, the face of a man calculating the cost of being involved. "What does he want?" Silas asked. "The land or the baby?" "Elsie, publicly." She folded her hands on the table. "The land is the real answer. Because if he controls her inheritance." She said it flatly, because she'd had 6 months to get past the nausea of the logic and arrive at the anger. "My husband left everything in trust for Elsie. Rufus can't touch it directly. But if a court decides she needs a male guardian, and if that guardian is him, he manages it until she's of age, and by then it's gone." "Yes." Silas turned his coffee cup in a circle on the table, a slow, thinking gesture that she recognized as the equivalent of other men pacing. "How far behind you is he?" "I don't know." I don't know if he's found anyone who saw me in Cincinnati. I don't know if he's already in the territory. She paused. I watch the road every morning. I know, Silas said. She looked at him. I see you at the window, he said, every morning before I go out. She hadn't known he'd noticed. She felt briefly and unexpectedly something she couldn't cleanly name. Not embarrassed, not grateful, something between the two that had no comfortable word. Like being seen more clearly than you'd intended and finding the exposure less terrible than you'd expected. I'm not going to pretend I have a plan, she said. I needed you to know why I've stayed as long as I have. It wasn't… She stopped, started again. I haven't stayed because I couldn't leave. I've stayed because leaving felt like walking back into the open, and I needed time to think. Silas nodded. He was quiet for another moment, still turning the cup. If he comes, he said, where are you going to go? Further west. And after that? She had no answer for that. The after that was the part she hadn't been able to think past, because every direction she looked had Rufus Bellamy's patience somewhere in it, and patience, in her experience, was the thing that wore people down eventually, regardless of how fast they ran. Silas pushed back from the table and stood up. He carried his cup to the counter, stood there with his back to her for a moment. Then he turned around and leaned against the counter the way he did when he was thinking through something practical, arms crossed, weight on his heels, not performing consideration, but actually doing it. The problem with running, he said, is that it tells him you think he can catch you. He can catch me. Maybe. In Kentucky, with his judge and his friends and his paperwork. He looked at her steadily. But you're not in Kentucky. She looked back at him. Something in his tone was different. Not the careful neutral he usually maintained, but something more direct, more engaged. The voice of a man who has stopped observing a problem and started thinking about it as his. She wasn't sure how she felt about that. She wasn't sure she had the luxury of feelings about it. What are you suggesting? She asked. I'm not suggesting anything yet. I'm saying the situation's different here than you might think. He picked up his coat from the peg. There's a man in Red Willow, Justice Harlan Pike. I know him. He's not easy and he's not fast, but he's fair, which is rarer than it sounds. And fair's what you need more than fast right now. He went toward the back door. Then he stopped with his hand on the frame. Don't decide anything today, he said. Just don't run today. He went out. The door closed. Nora sat at the table and looked at the window and thought about what it meant that a man she'd known for 12 days had just asked her, without making it a request, to trust him. She thought about it for a long time. The winter cap appeared on a Tuesday, 3 days after that conversation. Silas came back from a supply run to Red Willow in the early afternoon, and he brought flour and salt pork and a new bolt of lamp wick and a small parcel wrapped in brown paper that he set on the table next to the flour, without explanation, and went back out to deal with the horse. Nora picked up the parcel and opened it. It was a baby's cap, wool, the deep greenish-gray of pine needles. Well made, not fancy, but good solid work, the kind that would keep out cold and last several winters, and had been selected by someone who looked at the options and thought practically. It was exactly the right size for Elsie's head, which meant Silas had been paying more attention than she'd realized. She held it and felt the tightness in her throat again. Stronger this time. She heard him come back in. She turned around and he looked at the cap in her hands and then at the wall behind her, the expression of a man who has done something he was slightly uncertain about and is now refusing to regret it, regardless of how it lands. It's getting cold, he said. She needs something for her head. She has a bonnet. That bonnet's got holes in it. She looked at the cap. You didn't have to. I was in the store anyway. He was already moving toward the stove to check the fire, his back to her, the subject apparently concluded from his end. The woman at the counter said it'd fit a baby around 5 months. I said that was about right. That was about right, Nora said quietly. She put the cap on the table and picked up Elsie and fitted onto her daughter's head, adjusting the tie under her chin. Elsie accepted this with the patient tolerance she applied to being dressed, staring at nothing specific with the philosophical expression that had started to feel, to both adults in the room, distinctly like a personality trait rather than an accident of infant neurology. Silas looked at her from across the room for a moment. Then he went and stirred the fire, and neither of them said anything about it. But later that evening, when the lamp was low and Elsie was asleep, and Nora was mending a tear in Silas's spare shirt that she'd found in the basket, and decided to take care of without asking. Silas looked up from the piece of tack he was working on and said, without apparent context, "The cradle was mine to build." Nora stilled her hands on the shirt. She waited. "My wife and I," he said. He said it the way people say things they have rehearsed slightly, not because the saying is insincere, but because some sentences need rehearsal to get out intact. "She was 7 months along when she—" He stopped. Didn't finish the sentence. "It was a long winter." "I'm sorry," Nora said. "I built the cradle in January. She'd asked for it." He looked at the tack in his hands. "It was finished in February. She died in March." A pause. "The baby with her." The room was quiet except for the fire and the wind outside. 3 years ago, he said, which she already knew but understood he needed to say. She didn't ask questions. She didn't say any of the things people say. The packaged words that fill silence without meaning to and usually feel worse than silence. She kept her hands quiet on the shirt and let him have the room. After a moment he said, "I keep thinking I should move it, put it in the barn, at least, but I—" He shook his head, didn't finish. "You don't have to move it," she said. "It's been 3 years." "I know, you still don't have to move it." He looked at her. She looked back. And for a moment the distance between them, which had been closing, gradually, incrementally, in the way that distances close between two people who are both being careful, was just a room's width, and the room was warm, and both of them were somewhat less alone than they had been in a long time. "You should put Elsie in it," he said, "while you're here. It's a good cradle. It should do what it was made for." Nora's eyes stung unexpectedly. She looked down at the shirt. "Are you sure?" "No," he said honestly. "But do it anyway." She nodded. That was all. She went back to the mending, and he went back to the tack, and outside the Montana wind came down off the mountains the way it always did this time of year, cold and steady, and entirely indifferent to the small, tentative things happening in the house below it. Elsie slept in the cradle that night for the first time. Nora lay in the bed listening to the quiet sounds of her daughter's sleep. The small shifts, the occasional sigh, the rhythm of a baby who has eaten and is warm and has no knowledge of Kentucky or legal petitions or men who want things that aren't theirs. And she stared at the ceiling and tried to remember the last time she had felt like a room was hers, not borrowed, not temporary, not a place she was passing through. She couldn't find the memory. It had been too long. The house breathed around her. The fire had settled to coals. In the front room she could hear, faintly, familiar now, the particular creak of the chair Silas used when he was awake in the night, which was most nights, a detail she'd learned without meaning to. She thought about what he'd said. The cradle was made in January. His wife died in March. She thought about carrying that particular shape of grief for 3 years inside an empty house on a Montana ranch, with one chair at the table, and a calendar 2 years out of date, and a ledger full of small financial decisions being made by a man who had stopped caring very much whether they added up. She thought about how that was the saddest thing she had ever reconstructed from evidence without being told. And she thought about the winter cap, practical and green-gray on the table, and Elsie's hand grabbing his index finger the first morning, and the way he walked the room in the slow, uneven circuit when the baby cried, pausing at the window, at the wall, at the hearth, giving her things to look at, one at a time. She did not let herself draw conclusions. She was too careful for that, and her life was too uncertain, and there were too many miles between here and any version of the future she could actually count on. But she lay in the dark and listened to the house, and she did not watch the road in her mind. That was new. The supply inventory she'd been quietly conducting since the first week came to a head on the 15th morning, when she spread every number she had on the table and walked Silas through it with the focus she usually reserved for problems she'd already decided to fix. He sat across from her and did not look defensive, which she'd half expected. He looked like a man who already knew the information and had been waiting for someone else to say it out loud. The Henderson contract was the worst of it, but not the only thing. There were 2 suppliers overcharging on winter rates because Silas had not renegotiated since his wife was alive, which she deduced from the date the rates were last updated in the ledger. There was a hired hand from the previous spring who had been paid without a formal record, which meant either a record existed somewhere else or it didn't exist at all, and the second option was a problem for tax purposes. And the North Pasture lease agreement, She'd found it in the stack of papers he kept in the wooden box by the door, was set to expire in February, and contained an auto-renewal clause that would lock him into another 3 years at a rate 20% higher than the current fair rate for that type of land. She laid it all out. He looked at it. "You knew about the lease," she said. "I knew." "And you hadn't—" "No." She looked at him. "Why not?" He turned a page over and set it face down. It was the first evasive gesture she'd seen from him, and it told her more than an answer would have. It didn't seem urgent. "It expires in February. I know when it expires." "Silas," she said it quietly, not as a reprimand. "When did things stop seeming urgent?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, set it back down. "Around 3 years ago," he said. She nodded. She gathered the papers back into their order without saying anything else because there was nothing else to say that would improve on what he'd already admitted. She put them in a neat stack and set them by the ledger. "I'll draft letters to both suppliers this week," she said. "If you sign them, we can get the new rates in place before the snow." He looked at the stack of papers, then at her. "Why are you doing this?" "Because the numbers are wrong. You're not my—" He stopped. "I know," she said, carefully but clearly. "I'm not. But I know how to do this, and you need it done. And I'm here." She kept her voice even. "And maybe it's useful to feel useful." She hadn't planned to say that last part. She picked up the empty coffee cups and went to the stove and stood with her back to him until the moment settled. Behind her, she heard him pull the stack of papers toward him and open the ledger. When she turned around, he was writing something in the margin of the contract page, slow and deliberate, correcting a number he'd been looking at wrong for months. She put his coffee back in front of him and went to check on Elsie, and the morning went on the way mornings do when two people have been honest with each other about something small and are finding their way back to the ordinary things on the other side of it. Outside, the October sky had gone the heavy, particular gray of impending snow. Not yet falling, but close, the air holding that stillness that comes just before. The road was empty. The hills behind the property were darkening at the tree line. Somewhere east of them, 7 miles away in Red Willow, a man named Harlan Pike went about his work in the territorial office, knowing nothing yet of the case that was about to walk into his jurisdiction. And somewhere further east still, how far, Nora did not know, could not know, a man named Rufus Bellamy was asking questions and following a trail that was not quite cold. But that was the road. And Nora was not at the window. She was at the table, reading a lease agreement with a cup of hot coffee, in a house that had started quietly and without permission to feel like it might be worth staying in. For now, that was enough to hold on to. The snow started falling just before noon. The snow that started before noon on the 15th day did not stop for 3 days. It came down the way Montana snow comes down in late October. Not the gentle, decorative kind that settles on fences and looks like a painting, but the serious, business-minded kind that has a job to do and intends to do it, regardless of what anyone had planned. It packed against the north wall of the house, drifted across the yard in shapes that changed overnight, and turned the road to Red Willow into a pale, featureless line that could have been anything under all that white. Nora stopped watching it, not because the fear had gone. The fear had not gone, would not go until she had something more solid than distance between herself and Rufus Bellamy's patience, but because 3 days of snow had made watching feel futile in a way that was almost restful. Nobody was traveling that road in this weather. Nobody was asking questions in Red Willow about a widow with an infant when the temperature dropped below zero and the wind came off the mountains like something with a grudge. Even Rufus, methodical as he was, had limits imposed by weather and geography and the basic physical misery of moving across Montana in November. She used the 3 days well. She finished the letters to both suppliers and drafted a third to the land office regarding the North Pasture lease renewal, laying out the case for a renegotiated rate with the specific, unsentimental logic of someone who had spent 4 years watching money move through a farming operation and understood which arguments landed. She reorganized the root cellar, a project that revealed 3 things Silas didn't know he had, 4 things that had gone bad without his noticing, and a crock of preserved plums that someone had put up, by her estimation, at least 2 winters ago, and that were somehow still good. She repaired Silas's spare coat where the lining had separated at the shoulder, working by lamplight in the evenings while Silas sat across from her doing the thing he did, which was occupy the same space quietly, and without demand in a way she had come to find, against her better judgment, genuinely steadying. On the second snow day evening, she found him in the barn. She'd gone to tell him supper was ready and found him standing at the stall where the gray mare and her new foal were settled. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there with his arms on the top rail and his chin resting on them, watching the foal the way people watch things that are alive and small and recently arrived in the world, with that particular attention that doesn't require a reason. She stood in the doorway for a moment without announcing herself. The foal was on her feet, unsteady but committed, all legs and wobble, and the absolute conviction that this standing business was going to work out. The mare stood patiently next to her, not pushing, not hovering, just present, available. "She's stronger," Nora said. Silas didn't startle. He'd heard her come in. "Every day a little more." Nora came to stand at the rail beside him, not close enough to require comment, just close enough to see clearly. The foal turned her head and regarded them both with large, dark, completely unimpressed eyes. "What are you going to name her?" "Haven't thought about it." "You've been out here watching her every night." "That's not the same as naming her." Nora looked at the foal, then at Silas. He had that expression he got sometimes when something had gotten under his guard without his permission. Not soft. Silas Renford was constitutionally incapable of soft, but something adjacent to it, open in a way he usually wasn't. "She came out fighting," Nora said. "Wrong end first, you said. Took 3 hours. Then she should have a name that means something, not just whatever's convenient." He turned his head and looked at her. "You name her." She hadn't expected that. She looked back at the foal, the wobbling legs, the stubborn set of the small head, the way she kept attempting to reach her mother's side and nearly falling and trying again without apparent frustration. "May," Nora said. "My mother's name. She was stubborn too." Silas turned back to the foal. "May," he said, trying it out. The foal's ears moved. "See," Nora said. "She knows it already." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in the same general territory. It was the closest she'd heard from him, and it surprised her enough that she looked at the wall instead of at his face, because some things needed to be allowed to exist without being examined directly. "Supper's ready," she said. "Be in a minute." She went back to the house. The snow stopped on the third day and the road reappeared, and Nora was at the window again the next morning. Old habit. She'd thought the 3 days had broken it, but apparently habits have their own opinions about that. What she saw on the road that morning was not Rufus Bellamy's men. It was the Hendersons' hired hand, a boy of about 17 named Carl, who made supply runs between the Henderson Ranch and Red Willow and occasionally passed by the Renford property on the longer route. He stopped when he saw Silas in the yard, and they spoke for about 5 minutes. And then Carl rode on and Silas came back inside with an expression Nora had not seen on him before. "What?" she said immediately. He pulled off his gloves. He didn't draw it out, which she'd learned was characteristic of him. When he had something to say, he said it, which was either a quality she admired or the thing she found hardest about him depending on the day. "There's a man in Red Willow," he said. "Arrived 2 days ago. Asking around about a woman traveling alone with a baby." He looked at her steadily. Kentucky accent. Well-dressed. Has 2 men with him. The floor seemed to shift slightly beneath her. Not literally. She was standing perfectly still, but something in her inner structure moved, the way a building moves in wind, flexing rather than breaking. She had known this was coming. She had known from the moment she opened that letter under her door in Kentucky that this was the shape of the thing she was running from, that it would find geography insufficient eventually and catch up. Knowing it didn't make the arrival of it any easier. "How long has he been there?" she asked. Her voice came out steady. She was grateful for that. "Carl said 2 days, could be more." 2 days. The storm had lasted 3, which meant Rufus had been in Red Willow before the snow, had been sitting there in the settlement 7 miles away while the weather kept him from moving and kept her from knowing. "He has legal papers," Silas said. "Carl heard him mention them at the general store. Didn't hear the specifics." She sat down. Not because she wanted to sit down, but because her legs had made the decision without consulting her. She sat at the table, the The same table where she'd laid out Silas's ranch accounts 2 weeks ago with her hands steady and her mind clear, and she pressed her palms flat on the surface and breathed. "I have to leave," she said. "Today, before he finds out exactly where I am." "Nora, if I go north, there's a town, Harmon. I read about it in the—" "Nora." Not sharp, not a command, just her name, said with enough weight to stop the momentum of her thinking. She looked up at him. He was standing near the door with his arms crossed, and the particular stillness of a man who has already decided something and is waiting for the conversation to catch up to him. "Listen to me for a minute." She stopped. He came to the table and sat down across from her, which was not his usual position for a difficult conversation. Usually he stood, or found something to do with his hands, a cup, or a piece of tack, or whatever was nearby. Him sitting meant he'd thought about this before Carl came down the road. Maybe he'd been thinking about it since she told him about Rufus 2 weeks ago. "What he has," Silas said, "is a Kentucky petition, an unresolved one, by what you've told me. That's not a court order. That's not enforceable across territorial lines without a local court taking it up and agreeing to hear it. He can find a judge who will. He can try. That takes time. That takes someone local willing to act on another territory's unfinished business." He leaned forward slightly. "You're not in Kentucky, Nora. He came here expecting you to run when he showed up, because that's what you've been doing. If you run again, you're telling him he's right, that the fear works, that all he has to do is keep following." She looked at him. "You're saying I should stay." "I'm saying you should stop letting him pick the ground." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the post-storm silence was absolute, that particular hush that settles over a snow-covered landscape that makes the world feel both larger and more enclosed at the same time. "You said you know the justice in Red Willow," she said carefully. "Harlan Pike." "I've known him 12 years. What kind of man is he?" Silas considered this with the honesty she'd come to expect from him, which meant he didn't reach for a reassuring answer. "He's not going to do you any favors because you're a woman in a hard spot. He doesn't work that way, but he follows the law the way it's actually written, not the way someone with money wants it applied." He paused. "If your case is clean, it'll be clean in his court." "It's clean. It's just incomplete. The petition in Kentucky was filed on accusations that aren't supported, but the paperwork isn't settled yet because I left before the hearing." "Then we get ahead of it. You go before Rufus can walk in and tell his version first." She stared at him. "You're talking about me walking into a territorial court to contest a claim when I'm still technically fleeing the original hearing." "I'm talking about you stopping fleeing and starting contesting. There's a difference." "That's a very fine difference, Silas. It's the difference between him having the story and you having it." She looked at her hands on the table. They were not shaking, which surprised her. The rest of her felt like the inside of a struck bell, resonating, vibrating, all the sound running through the structure at once. But her hands were flat and still. She thought about Elsie asleep in the next room in a carved wooden cradle. She thought about a man in Red Willow with well-pressed clothes and legal papers, and 2 men he was paying to be intimidating. She thought about the lawyer she'd sold her mother's necklace to pay for, who had told her thin wasn't the same as harmless, and she thought about the fact that thin also wasn't the same as strong. "If we go to Pike," she said slowly, "and Rufus is already in Red Willow, he'll know where I am. He'll come here." "Probably." "And you're all right with that?" Silas looked at her with the direct, uncomplicated expression of a man who has made a decision and isn't going to complicate it by talking around it. "My name's on the deed of this property. My name's known in this county. And I've got 12 years of Harlan Pike knowing my word means something." He paused. "You've been carrying this alone for 6 months. You don't have to anymore." The thing in her throat was back. She had become genuinely tired of that particular sensation, the one that meant she was feeling something large and inconvenient at a moment that required clear thinking. She pressed her palms harder against the table. "I don't want you involved in my problems," she said. "That's not—" She stopped. "You've already done more than you should have. I'm not asking your permission, not unkindly, just plainly. I'm telling you what I'm going to do. What you do is up to you." She looked at him for a long moment. "When would we go?" she asked. "Tomorrow morning, before he starts moving around the county, asking questions door to door." He stood up and reached for his gloves again. "Give me today to get word to Pike. I know a man who rides that road regular. He can carry a message this afternoon. He went back to the door. She watched him go. Silas, she said. He stopped. She didn't have a sentence ready for what she wanted to say. She had the shape of it, a gratitude that was too large for the word thank you and too specific for any of the other available words. But the sentence wouldn't come. So she said the only true thing she had. I'm scared, she said, simply, without framing or apology. He looked at her from across the room. I know, he said. Me too, a little. It was such an unexpected thing for him to say that it took the air out of the fear for a moment, just enough to breathe. He went out to find his messenger. The ride to Red Willow. The next morning was cold in the specific way that late October rides are cold in Montana, which is to say comprehensively and without negotiation. Nora had Elsie tucked inside her coat in the sling, the green-gray wool cap pulled down to the baby's eyebrows, and she rode beside Silas on the roan mare while he drove the wagon with the supplies he'd been meaning to pick up anyway, because arriving in Red Willow with a practical reason was better than arriving in Red Willow with no reason except the one they actually had. They didn't talk much on the ride. The cold discouraged it, and besides, Nora had run through every version of the conversation with Pike that she could construct, every question he might ask, every angle Rufus's papers might be used to press, until the inside of her head felt like a room that had been searched thoroughly and put back together slightly wrong. At some point, about halfway to Red Willow, Elsie woke up and registered her opinions about cold and movement and insufficient breakfast with the directness her mother had come to expect. Nora adjusted her position in the sling, and the baby quieted, and she felt Silas glance over from the wagon without turning her head to confirm it. She's loud, he said. She knows what she wants. So does her mother. Nora looked at the road ahead. Was that a compliment? Mostly. She didn't push it. She was learning when not to push things. Harlan Pike was a broad, deliberate man of about 60, who had the manner of someone who had listened to a great many people try to convince him of things over the years, and had developed a very accurate internal instrument for detecting the difference between argument and truth. His office in Red Willow was small and warm and cluttered in the organized way of a man who knows where everything is even if nobody else would, and he stood up when they came in and looked at Nora and Elsie with an expression that was neither welcoming nor hostile, but precisely, professionally neutral. Silas, he said. Harlan. Silas took off his hat. This is Nora Bellamy. She needs to give you a statement. I heard you were coming. He looked at Nora. Sit down, Mrs. Bellamy. She sat. She had Elsie in her lap, which was not ideal for projecting the image of a composed woman presenting a legal matter, but it was what she had, and she'd decided on the ride in that she was not going to apologize for it or try to minimize it. Elsie was 4 months old and was the reason they were here, and there was no version of this conversation where her existence was beside the point. She told Pike everything she'd told Silas, but in a different order, leading with the legal facts rather than the personal ones, the way she'd spent the previous night reorganizing it in her head. The date of her husband's death, the date of the petition, the specific language of the accusation in the petition, which she had memorized because she had read it enough times that the words were burned into the inside of her eyelids, abandoned of domestic virtue and insufficient of character for the sole provision of a minor child. She said those words out loud in Pike's office and felt a cold fury that she had learned to keep below the surface of her voice, but that she suspected was visible in her face regardless. Pike listened. He wrote things down. He asked 3 questions: the name of the Kentucky county, the name of the petitioning party, and the date the petition had been filed, and then he sat back and looked at what he'd written. The man currently in Red Willow, he said. Rufus Bellamy. He's my husband's brother. He came to my office yesterday afternoon. He said it without particular emphasis, watching her face. He has a copy of the petition, signed by a Kentucky notary. He also has a letter from a reverend somebody in your county claiming you left a substantial debt unpaid and abandoned your husband's people. Nora's jaw tightened. My husband had no people except Rufus, and the debt was the funeral, which Rufus paid for uninvited so he could use it as leverage. He presented it as evidence of financial irresponsibility. He manufactured it. The day I received his letter demanding repayment, my daughter was 11 weeks old and I had been a widow for 3 months. Pike looked at her for a moment. Then he looked down at his notes. The petition, as filed, is unresolved. The Kentucky hearing was scheduled and not held because you left the jurisdiction. Because I had reason to believe I would not receive a fair hearing. That may be. But a missing petitioner is something a court can read in several directions. He tapped his pen on the paper. What Mr. Bellamy has is not an order, and it is not enforceable in this territory without my court taking it up, which I have not agreed to do. She waited. What you have, Pike said, is a statement made before this office, which I am entering into the record as of this morning, that establishes that your position is registered here and that you are not a fugitive from process, but a party to an ongoing civil matter. He looked up. It also establishes that you were here first. Something in her chest loosened by approximately 1 degree. Can he force a hearing here? She asked. He can request one. I can decline it. The petition is thin. The Reverend's letter is character testimony, not evidence, and the debt claim has no documentation I've seen. He set down his pen. I am not telling you there is no risk, Mrs. Bellamy. I am telling you that right now, today, he does not have what he needs to take that child from you in my jurisdiction. What if he goes to a different judge? There is no different judge in this county. A pause. County. A pause. I'm the judge in this county. She felt Silas, seated to her left, shift slightly. Not quite a reaction, just the small movement of a man releasing tension he'd been holding. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet. He's still in town, and he's not a man who gives up easy. I can tell that from 10 minutes with him. He looked at Silas. You're keeping them at your place? Yes? Then keep your head down and wait for him to make a move I can respond to officially. Right now, all he's done is ask questions and show me papers. That's not a crime. He closed his notebook. But if he steps onto private property or attempts to take the child without an order, that's a different conversation. They left the office. Outside in the cold of the main street, Nora adjusted Elsie's cap and breathed the sharp air and felt Silas walk out behind her and stop beside her on the wooden sidewalk. The settlement of Red Willow was not large. One main street, a general store, a feed and supply, a boarding house, 3 other buildings with purposes she hadn't identified. It took about 4 seconds of standing on that sidewalk to scan the entire visible length of it. On the far end, near the boarding house, 3 men stood in conversation. 2 were large in the way men are large when being large is part of their job description. The third was not large. He was medium height, carefully dressed in a coat that had not been purchased in Montana, and he had the particular posture of a man who is accustomed to looking at things and calculating their value. He was already looking at them. The distance was too great to read his expression with certainty, but she saw the moment he registered her, the slight adjustment in his stance, the fractional change in the angle of his head, the posture of recognition. Don't look away, Silas said quietly beside her. She hadn't intended to. She stood on that sidewalk in Red Willow on a November morning and looked at Rufus Bellamy from 40 yards across a frozen street, and she did not move, and she did not look away, and she kept her hand steady on Elsie's back inside the sling. Rufus looked back. Then one of the large men said something, and Rufus turned and went into the boarding house. Nora breathed. Come on, Silas said. Let's get the supplies and go home. Home. He'd said it without marking it. The word dropped into the sentence the way you drop words that seem obvious. She didn't point it out. She followed him to the supply store and kept Elsie close, and home sat in her mind for the rest of the morning like a stone dropped in water, sending out rings. The ride back was quieter than the ride in. Silas drove the wagon, and Nora rode beside him, and Elsie slept in the sling, worn out from cold and newness and the complicated emotions of attending one's first territorial court interaction at 4 months old. The sky had gone white in the way it goes in late November, the light flat and directionless, the hills on both sides of the road the dark green of frozen pines under fresh snow. About 2 miles from the ranch, Nora said. He knows where I am now. He probably knew before today. Now he knows we know he knows. That's the part that changes things. Silas glanced at her. He can't pretend he's just asking questions anymore. We took that away from him. She thought about Rufus's face in that moment across the street. The adjustment in his posture. She knew that adjustment. She'd seen it at the funeral when she'd told Rufus calmly and quietly in front of 3 other people that she would be handling her husband's estate herself and would not be requiring his assistance. The specific recalibration of a man who has been moving towards something and encountered unexpected resistance and is now deciding whether to find another angle or simply push harder. Rufus had always pushed harder. "He'll come to the ranch," she said. "Yes." "You know that, and you're still not changing my mind." He said it without looking at her, eyes on the road. "You can stop checking." She had not been aware she was checking. She thought about that. "What do you want me to do when he comes?" she asked. Specifically. "Stand where he can see you. Let him say what he came to say. Don't run, and don't argue more than necessary." He paused. "The argument's already been had in Pike's office. All you have to do now is be visible and unafraid." "I am afraid." "I know. Be visible anyway." She looked at the road ahead. The ranch property was coming into view. The fence line first, then the barn roof, then the chimney smoke rising straight up in the windless cold, the particular gray-white of a fire that had been banked and was now catching again, the color of a house that had someone in it. She had started the fire before they left. It had not occurred to her to notice that until this moment. "Silas," she said. "When this is over—" She stopped, started again. "After Rufus leaves, and Pike has his statement on record, and this is settled. What did you think happens then?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. It wasn't an evasion. She could tell the difference by now between his silences, the one that meant he was choosing words, and the one that meant he was deciding whether to use them. "I think," he said finally, slowly, "that you asked me once if you could sleep in my barn." "I remember." "And you've been in my house for almost 3 weeks." "I remember that too." "And the second chair's still at the table." He guided the horses around a frozen rut in the road with the automatic ease of someone who has driven this road hundreds of times. "I think when this is over, you should decide for yourself what happens next. And I think whatever you decide, you should decide it because it's what you want, not because you're running from something and not because you owe me anything." He paused. "Those are the only 2 things I want off the table." She looked at him for a long moment. His profile against the white sky was weathered and particular and in no way remarkable to a stranger, but she had been looking at it across a breakfast table for 3 weeks and had learned its expressions well enough to read what wasn't being said alongside what was. He was afraid too. Not of Rufus Bellamy. Not exactly. Of something quieter and more personal than that. The specific fear of a man who has begun to want something after a long time of wanting nothing, and who has enough experience of loss to understand exactly what wanting costs. She looked back at the road, at the chimney smoke. "The second chair's been at the table since the first morning," she said. "Yes." "You put it there?" "I did." "I've been meaning to ask you about that." He glanced at her. "No, you haven't." She almost smiled. It was the same almost smile she'd had at the very beginning, the ghost of the architecture of one. "No, I haven't." They reached the fence line of the ranch. Silas slowed the horses at the gate and she dismounted to open it, the way she'd learned to do without being asked on the 3rd day. And he drove through, and she closed it behind him and remounted, and they went the rest of the way to the house in the particular silence of 2 people who have said something important by saying almost nothing, and both know it. 4 days passed before Rufus came. They were the strangest 4 days Nora had experienced since arriving at the ranch. Not peaceful exactly, more like the stillness between a lightning strike and the thunder, that charged, specific quiet, that means something large is in motion at a distance and will arrive in its own time regardless of whether you're ready. She did not stop watching the road. She was honest with herself about that. But the watching had changed quality somehow. It was less like waiting for a blow and more like the attention a person pays to weather, the deliberate tracking of something you can't stop but can at least see coming. She cooked. She managed the accounts. She carried Elsie and thought through scenarios. She sent the letters to the 2 suppliers with Silas's signature on them, sealed and dispatched with the Henderson boys' next supply run. She mended things and organized things and did the 10,000 small tasks that constitute the actual substance of keeping a household alive through a Montana winter. And she let the work occupy the parts of her mind that would otherwise have spent those 4 days purely on fear. Silas watched her do all of this and said very little about it, which was the right thing to do and which she appreciated in the wordless way you appreciate things that are simply correct. On the 3rd evening, he moved the cradle. She didn't see him do it. She came in from the root cellar with the preserved plums she'd decided to serve with supper and found that the cradle had been moved from the corner of the bedroom to a position nearer the fire in the front room. Not obtrusive, not central, just repositioned into the life of the house, in a way that said this is part of things now, not a relic of something else. She set the plums on the counter and looked at it for a moment. Then she put Elsie in it, something she'd been doing at night but hadn't done in the daytime, in the shared spaces of the house. Elsie looked up at the ceiling with her philosophical expression and was quiet. Silas came in from the barn 20 minutes later and saw the cradle in its new position with Elsie in it, in the middle of the house, visible from the doorway. He stopped for just a moment. Then he hung up his coat and came to the table and picked up the mug she'd set out for him. "Supper in about an hour," she said. "I'll wash up," he said. Neither of them made anything of it. That was, she'd come to understand, its own kind of making something of it. Rufus Bellamy came on the fourth day, mid-morning, riding a dark horse with the two men behind him in the formation of people who expect their numbers to do a significant part of their talking. He came down the main road toward the ranch property with the air of a man arriving at a foregone conclusion, and Nora saw him from the window while Silas was still in the barn. Her first physical response was the one she'd been having for 6 months, the pull of the body toward movement, toward the door, toward anything that was not standing still in a place someone had found her. She felt it fully, located it accurately, and then she put on her coat. She went to the barn door. "Silas, he's here." He came out immediately. He didn't ask how many or how far. He looked at the road, assessed what she'd already assessed, and looked at her. "Ready?" he said. "No," she said. "Close enough." He moved to stand beside her. Not in front, not shielding, beside. That position they'd found without discussing it, the one that said, "This is shared ground." She stepped forward into the yard. Rufus pulled his horse up at the fence line. He looked at Nora for a long moment with the expression she remembered from every interaction they'd ever had. That calculating, surface cordial assessment, like a man reading a ledger and deciding what the numbers mean for him personally. "Nora," he said. He made her name sound like a category. "Rufus." She made his sound like a fact. He looked at the baby in her arms, then at Silas, then back at her. He was running numbers. She could see it, adding and subtracting in that interior ledger of his, the one that contained columns for risk and leverage and the likely behavior of people under pressure. "I've come a long way," he said. "I'd have thought you'd make this easier." "I'd have thought you'd have more to say after traveling this far," she said. "That's all you've got? You've come a long way?" Something moved in his face. He hadn't expected that tone. He'd expected the woman who had opened a letter in a black dress with an 11-week-old infant in her arms and then run. He was recalibrating. "You left during legal proceedings," he said. "That doesn't look good, Nora, for you or for what you're trying to claim." "I left because I didn't believe I would get a fair hearing in a court where you had friends, and I had a 3-month-old baby and a lawyer I paid for by selling my mother's necklace." She kept her voice even. It cost her, but she kept it. "I have since given my statement to Justice Harlan Pike in Red Willow. It's on the record, dated before you arrived at his office." Rufus's expression shifted again. Smaller this time, harder to read. "You paid for my brother's funeral," Nora said. "I know that. I didn't ask you to, and you didn't tell me you intended to. You decided to, and then you decided what it cost, and then you decided what I owed you for it." She adjusted Elsie slightly in her arms. "But my husband's debt isn't my debt, and my daughter isn't payment, and whatever you filed in Kentucky doesn't mean the same thing it would have meant if I'd stayed in that courtroom and let you tell the story first." "There are 2 men with me," Rufus said. He said it without particular heat, the way you state a fact. "I see them." She didn't look at them. "There are 2 of us as well, and one of us is Silas Renford, whose name has been on this county's land record for 10 years, and one of us spoke to Harlan Pike 4 days ago." She met his eyes. "If you believe you have a legitimate claim to my daughter, or to the property my husband left her in his will, you are welcome to make that claim in the Montana Territorial Court. Justice Pike will hear it." Rufus looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Silas, the way men sometimes look at other men when a woman has said something they didn't anticipate, searching for the source of it, as if it must have come from somewhere else. Silas looked back at him with the flat, specific expression of a man who has nothing to prove and knows it. One of the large men shifted in his saddle. The other looked at the sky. Rufus gathered his reins. "We'll see what Pike has to say about all of this," he said. "He's already said it," Nora told him. "You have a copy of his notes from your visit. I'd reread them." Rufus turned his horse. His two men turned theirs. They rode back down the road the way they'd come, not fast, not running, just going, and Nora stood in the yard of Silas Renford's ranch and watched them until they were out of sight. Then she exhaled. It was a long, slow exhale, the kind that starts somewhere deep and comes out carrying a lot with it. She didn't move for a moment. She stood in the cold yard with Elsie against her chest and felt the specific, strange, unfamiliar sensation of having stood in a place and not run from it. Silas said nothing for a moment. Then, "You all right?" "I don't know yet." She looked at the empty road. "Ask me in an hour." He nodded. He went back to the barn. She went into the house and sat at the table, so her side of the table, the side she'd been sitting on for 3 weeks. And she put Elsie in the cradle by the fire, and she sat there in the warm, quiet kitchen and waited to find out what she was. An hour later, she was all right. She got up and made lunch. Rufus Bellamy did not leave Red Willow. Nora had half expected him to. She'd constructed a version of events in her head where his appearance at the ranch, met with something other than the terrified compliance he'd been counting on, would be enough to make the calculation unprofitable. Rufus was a practical man in the way that certain predators are practical. He didn't expend more energy than necessary, and he didn't fight battles he'd already lost. She had thought, standing in the yard watching him ride away, that the thing was essentially over, that she had won the ground by holding it. She was wrong. She found out 3 days later when Carl came down the road again. Not a supply run this time. He came specifically to the Renford property, which he had never done before. And when Silas met him at the fence line, the conversation was short, and Carl's face had the look of someone delivering news he wished he didn't have. Silas came inside without his usual pause to hang his coat. He stood in the kitchen doorway, still wearing it, and Nora looked at him from the table where she was working on the ledger, and she knew from the particular set of his expression that the thing was not over. "He filed," Silas said. She set down the pen. "With Pike?" "With Pike." He came to the table and sat down. "Formal petition to recognize the Kentucky proceeding in the Montana Territorial Court. He found 2 local men willing to sign as character witnesses against you. I don't know who, Carl didn't know names, and he's added something new." A pause. "He's claiming you've been living in an irregular domestic arrangement on this property. Unmarried, in the house of an unmarried man. He's using it as additional evidence of moral unfitness." The room was very quiet. Nora heard Elsie breathing in the cradle by the fire, the small, steady, uncomplicated sound of a baby who had no knowledge of any of this and was currently engaged in the serious work of sleeping. She looked at the cradle for a moment, then back at Silas. "He's going to use your house against me," she said. "He's going to try." "Silas, this is—" She stopped. Started over. "If I've put your reputation into this, if being associated with me is now something that can be turned around and used as a—" "Stop," he said. Not harshly. Just with the finality of a man who has already moved past a consideration and doesn't want to revisit it. "I'm not worried about my reputation." "You should be. If Pike thinks—" "I know what Pike thinks. I've known the man for 12 years. He looked at her. "But the moral unfitness argument is real. It's a legitimate angle, and Rufus found it, and we need to deal with it." She looked at her hands. The pen was still between her fingers, and she set it deliberately on the table, aligning it with the edge of the ledger the way she did when she needed her hands to do something specific, so the rest of her could think. "How do we deal with it?" she asked. Her voice came out more careful than she felt. Silas was quiet for a moment. He turned his coffee cup in the slow circle that meant he was working through something. Outside the window, the Montana afternoon was the gray-white of an overcast winter day, the kind of light that makes everything look slightly more difficult than it actually is. "There's one way," he said, "that makes the whole argument disappear." She looked at him. He looked back. The sentence he hadn't said sat in the kitchen between them as clearly as if he'd spoken it, taking up space, waiting to be addressed. "Silas," she said carefully, "don't do something because it solves a legal problem." "I'm not." "You might think you're not." "Nora." He said her name with enough weight to stop her. "I've been thinking about it since before Rufus filed anything." She stared at him. He met her eyes without flinching, which was characteristic of him, and which she found, in this particular moment, both steadying and terrifying. "How long before?" she asked. He picked up the coffee cup, set it back down. "Since the night with the biscuits, if I'm honest." The biscuits. The first morning, with the weevil flower and the second chair and Elsie on the floor tracking the ceiling with new eyes. That had been a month ago. "That's too fast," she said. "Probably. I've been here barely a month." "I know how long you've been here." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not asking because of Rufus. I'm telling you about Rufus because you deserve to know all of it and make a clear decision. Those are two different things." She stood up from the table. Not to leave, just because sitting still had become insufficient for the size of what was happening in her chest. She went to the window and looked at the road, and was aware of the irony of that, the habit she'd built, and not quite broken, looking at the road when things got difficult. It was empty. Just the road. "My husband died 6 months ago," she said to the window. "I know. I haven't—" She stopped. Tried again. "The last time someone asked me something like this, I was 22 years old and my mother was still alive, and I had never been further than 50 miles from where I was born." She turned around. "I'm a completely different person than that woman." "I know that too." He wasn't moving, wasn't pushing, just sitting at the table in his coat, patient in the way he was patient with things. With the mare in a difficult foaling, with accounts that needed untangling, with the kind of waiting that required you to stay exactly where you were and not try to speed anything up. "I need to think," she said. "Take whatever time you need. Don't be reasonable right now, it makes this harder." He almost smiled. She could see the edge of it, the particular flicker that passed through his face when something surprised him into nearly showing it. He pressed his mouth flat and looked at the table. She went to check on Elsie, not because Elsie needed checking, but because she needed a reason to leave the room for 2 minutes. She thought about it for 2 days. She didn't make it obvious, or tried not to, though she suspected Silas was no more fooled by her ordinary behavior than she was by his. She cooked and managed the accounts and carried Elsie and watched the road. And inside all of that, she turned the question over the way you turn a stone, looking at every face of it. There were things she knew clearly. She knew she was not in love with Silas Renford in the way people were in love in the novels she'd read, the kind that announced itself with certainty and consumed everything. She'd been in that kind of love once, at 22, and it had been real, and it had been good, and she had not stopped grieving the man who held it, even while she understood, somewhere practical and honest, that grief was not the same as stopped. She knew she trusted Silas. That was not a small thing. Trust, in her experience, was built out of 100 small acts of consistency, and she had been watching his consistency for a month. The way he said things plainly and meant them, the way he didn't demand gratitude, the way he'd put himself between Rufus Bellamy's legal maneuvering and her daughter without being asked, and without treating it as a favor. She knew that Elsie, who had no complicated feelings about anything except hunger and temperature and being put down, reached for his hand now when he came close. That was not evidence of anything except that infants are good at sensing where the steady warmth is. But she noticed it. She knew the house had changed since she arrived, not just the organized cupboards and the repaired code and the fixed accounts, something more fundamental than the practical things. There were voices in it. Arguments about the supplier rates, small and good-natured. Laughter once, actual laughter, over a catastrophically burned batch of cornbread that she'd been too distracted by an account error to watch. And that had come out the color and approximate texture of charcoal. The kind of thing that is only funny when there are 2 people in a kitchen, because one person with a burned pan is just a sad evening. She knew that a month ago she would not have been able to imagine staying anywhere, that the staying had seemed impossible, the settling seemed like something that happened to people who had not had reason to learn better. She thought about what Silas had said on the ride back from Red Willow, that she should decide because it was what she wanted, not because she was running from something or owed him something. Those off the table. She examined the question without either of those things attached to it. On the second evening, she went to the front room where Silas was working on the ledger. He'd taken over the supplier correspondence himself, which she'd noticed and not remarked on, and she sat down across from him and waited for him to look up. He looked up. "Yes," she said. He looked at her for a moment, just held her eyes. the same steadiness he brought to everything. Then he nodded once, a small dip of the head that contained more than it showed. "All right," he said, "not because of Rufus. I know. And I need you to understand that I—" She stopped. "There are things I'm still carrying, about my husband, about the last 6 months. I'm not—" She made a gesture with her hand that meant something she didn't have precise words for. "I'm not arriving clean. Neither am I." He said it without hesitation, with the honesty that was one of the things about him she had decided she trusted most. "I've got 3 years of empty house in me. That doesn't disappear." "No," she said, "it doesn't. But maybe we're the right kind of complicated for each other." She looked at him. "That is possibly the least romantic proposal I have ever heard." "Was it a proposal? I thought you said yes first." She felt the smile before she could prevent it. The real one this time. Not the ghost of the architecture, but the thing itself. And she looked at the table to give herself a moment to have it privately. When she looked back up, he was watching her with the expression she'd come to know as his version of warmth. Not demonstrative, not performed, just present. Fully, quietly present. "I did say yes first," she admitted. "So you proposed to me." "That's not—" She stopped. "Fine, yes. I proposed to you. You're welcome." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, brief and warm, and then gone, back to the ledger. But she felt it for the rest of the evening. Silas went to Pike's office the next morning alone, which was Nora's suggestion. She had reasoned, and Silas had agreed without much argument, that the information would land differently coming from him, that Pike needed to receive it as a man informing his justice of a coming legal change, rather than as a couple presenting a strategy to neutralize a petition, and that the distinction mattered for how Pike would receive it and record it. She waited at the ranch with Elsie and went through the supplier invoices twice and reorganized the root cellar shelf that didn't need reorganizing and was generally not the kind of person she had any patience for being. Silas came back in the early afternoon. "How did he take it?" she asked, before he'd even gotten his coat off. "He took it the way Pike takes everything, wrote it down and said he'd update the record." Silas hung his coat. "He also said, and I'm quoting him directly here, that it's about time." Nora stared. "Harlan Pike said that?" "His exact words. He met me once for 20 minutes. Apparently that was sufficient." He sat down at the table. "He's going to send formal notice to the Red Willow boarding house today. The petition is filed by Rufus Bellamy, names you as an unmarried woman in an irregular arrangement. That characterization is now legally inapplicable." She let that settle. The petition, as its secondary argument, the one Rufus had added, the one designed to layer shame onto the legal argument, to make the moral case that would stick in a judge's mind regardless of what the paperwork actually supported, that argument was gone, removed by a single change of fact. "He'll still have the original petition," she said, "the unfitness claim." "He will, but Pike made it clear, both times now, that a Kentucky petition without supporting evidence isn't something he's inclined to act on." Silas folded his hands on the table. "And there's something else. Pike asked me, while I was there, whether you had anyone back in Kentucky who could speak to the situation, anyone who knew you before, who knew your husband." "My husband's foreman," she said immediately. "Thomas Garrett. He worked that farm for 20 years. He was at the wedding." She paused. "He didn't like Rufus. He never said it directly to me, but I could see it every time Rufus came around. Pike wants a name and location. He's going to send a letter of inquiry, official territorial court letterhead, asks Garrett to provide a written account of what he knows. Rufus will find out. Probably, but by then it'll be in Pike's hands, not something Rufus can intercept." He looked at her. "It also tells Rufus that the net is wider than he thought, that there are people being asked questions he didn't control." She thought about Thomas Garrett. 70 years old, leather-faced, a man of about 12 words total in most situations. She thought about him receiving an official letter from a Montana territorial court and what he would do with it. She thought about 20 years of watching Rufus Bellamy operate, of knowing things a foreman knew about the financial arrangements of the men he worked for, of filing those things away in the careful memory of a man who understood that information, stored correctly, eventually becomes useful. "He'll write," she said. "He won't be happy about it, but he'll write." "Good." Silas unfolded his hands. "Now, There's one more thing, Pike said. She waited. He wants us married before the month is out, formally registered. He'll conduct it himself if we want, or we can find a circuit minister, but he wants the record clean, dated. Pike is very interested in the date of things. He's a judge. Dates are how things happen or don't happen legally. Silas looked at her with the direct steadiness that was simply his face when he was being serious. Is that all right? You're asking if it's all right that we get married before the month is out, when we decided yesterday. When you proposed yesterday. She gave him a flat look. He did not retreat from it. Yes, she said. It's all right. They were married 11 days later, on a Thursday morning, in Harlan Pike's office in Red Willow. There was not a ceremony that would be described in anyone's correspondence as grand. The office was the same cluttered, warm, paper-stacked room where Nora had first given her statement, and Pike had made exactly one concession to the occasion, which was to put on a different coat. Silas wore the coat Nora had relined at the shoulder. Nora wore the better of her two dresses, a dark blue wool that had traveled from Kentucky in the bottom of her bag and had survived the journey in reasonable condition. Elsie wore the green-gray cap. The ceremony itself took under 10 minutes. Pike read the necessary words from the territorial marriage record book in the same tone he used for everything. Deliberate, unhurried, giving each word its weight and not one syllable more. Silas said yes and meant it with the particular contained quality that characterized everything he meant. Nora said yes and felt the words sit differently in her body than she'd expected, not heavier than before, as though adding weight to what she already carried, but differently distributed, like rearranging the load so the balance was better. When it was done, Pike signed the record and dated it and turned it around for them to sign as well. Nora signed her new name for the first time and looked at it on the page and felt something she could not precisely categorize. Not simple happiness, not relief, not the uncomplicated joy of a storybook ending, but something more honest than any of those. Something that had uncertainty in it alongside the warmth, that acknowledged this was real and real things were complicated, and that complicated things done with the right person were still worth doing. She looked up and found Silas looking at the signature too. Nora Renford, he said, testing the sound of it. Don't say it like you're reading a receipt, she said. The corner of his mouth moved. Nora Renford, he said again, differently, just slightly. Enough. Pike handed them the copy of the record and shook Silas's hand and nodded at Nora with the expression of a man who considers his work done satisfactorily and has the next matter to attend to. As they were leaving, he said without looking up from his desk, I'll have notice of the marriage record sent to the boarding house this afternoon. Nora stopped in the doorway. Is he still there? Checked out yesterday. Pike turned a page. Took his men with him. She stood in the doorway of the territorial office in Red Willow on a Thursday in November and absorbed that. Rufus had left. Before the ceremony, before the notice, before whatever final argument he'd been constructing had arrived at its conclusion. He had performed his own calculation and arrived at a number he didn't like, and he had left. Why? She asked. Not of Pike specifically, of the room. Because the ground shifted, Silas said behind her. He'd heard Pike's words too. He came here expecting a widow with no anchor. Every day you were here longer, the calculation changed. She thought about Rufus riding back east. The careful, patient man with his legal papers and his character witnesses and his arrangement of debt as leverage. She thought about what it had cost him in time and money to follow her this far, and what the accounting looked like from his side when the widow had turned out to have a territorial court statement on record and a 12-year acquaintance of the local justice, and was now legally Nora Renford with a signed certificate in her hand. She thought about the foreman's letter, already sent by Pike's messenger to Kentucky. Whatever Thomas Garrett wrote, and she believed he would write something useful, because Thomas Garrett had spent 20 years watching and had opinions. That letter was already in motion. Rufus couldn't stop it. He'd left because the ground had shifted, because he was practical and he'd done the math. Good, she said, and walked out into the November cold. The weeks that followed Rufus's departure had a different texture than the weeks before. Before, the house had been organized around a threat. Not consciously, not dramatically, but the way all living spaces organize themselves around the largest thing they're managing. Every small daily act had the threat underneath it. The way a house built on unstable ground has the instability in every wall, even when nothing is visibly wrong. watching the road, the careful management of hope, the particular energy of two people who both know something is coming and are preparing for it without talking about the preparing. After, there was just the house, and the work, and the winter settling into the Montana hills in that long, patient, thorough way it did, as if it had no particular hurry because it intended to stay a while. Nora found the adjustment stranger than she'd expected. She'd been in motion for 6 months, not just physically, but internally, her mind constantly running routes and contingencies and what-ifs. That motion had structured her. It had given her a reason to be efficient, to be vigilant, to keep her feelings compactly organized. Now the motion had stopped, and she was standing still in a place that was legally and genuinely her own, and she kept catching herself looking for the next threat, the way a person who's been flinching for a long time flinches at things that aren't there anymore. She mentioned this to Silas one evening in December, not as a complaint but as an observation, because she'd noticed that observation was something they did well together. He listened to her describe it, the odd restlessness, the reaching for the next problem when the immediate problems were resolved. And then he said, "That sounds like a body that learned a particular kind of survival and doesn't know yet that the season changed." She looked at him. "That's unexpectedly perceptive." "You say that like it's surprising." "I say it because you usually express yourself in about a third of the words that would have taken most people." "Most people use too many." He turned his coffee cup. "What do you need to do with the restless feeling? Not fix it, just do with it." She thought about that. "Work," she said. "Real work. Not just maintaining what's here. Something that's forward-looking." He nodded. "I was going to talk to you about the spring herd count, if you wanted to be involved in the planning." "I want to be involved in the planning." "You might want to hear what the planning involves before you commit." "I've been running your accounts for 2 months. I know what the planning involves." He looked at her. "You've been running them for less than 2 months. We've been married for 3 weeks. The accounts predate this marriage." "Fair." He pulled the ledger from the stack and slid it across the table. "Here's where I think we are going into spring. Tell me what I'm missing." She pulled it toward her and opened it, and they sat across from each other in the warm kitchen on a December evening and worked. And outside the snow came down, and May moved in the barn, and Elsie slept in the cradle by the fire, and the house was full of the specific, unremarkable, irreplaceable sounds of people who are home. The letter from Thomas Garrett arrived in January, addressed to Justice Harlan Pike, Montana Territory. Pike sent word to the ranch, and Silas rode in alone to receive it, and he came back with a copy that Pike had made for the Renford file, and his expression carried something she'd learned to read as significant news being held steady. She was at the table with Elsie in her lap when he came in. She looked at his face and said, "What does it say?" He sat down and handed her the copy without preamble. Thomas Garrett's handwriting was the handwriting of a man who did not write often, but who, when he did, wrote with the careful deliberateness of someone who understood the weight of putting something permanent on paper. It was not eloquent. It was better than eloquent. It was precise. He wrote that he had worked the Bellamy land for 22 years, first under the father and then under the son. He wrote that he had been present at the marriage of Nora to James Bellamy, and that Nora had managed the household accounts from the second year of marriage with full cooperation of her husband, and that the farm had been in better financial condition during those years than in any prior period of his employment. He wrote that James Bellamy had told him directly, in the autumn before his death, that his will left everything to his wife and daughter, and that he had written it that way because he trusted Nora's judgment with the land more than he trusted anyone else's, including members of his own family. He wrote that he had never in 22 years of working that property observed Nora Bellamy to be anything other than a capable and devoted woman and mother. He wrote that Rufus Bellamy had, in his observation, demonstrated ongoing interest in the property that went beyond fraternal concern, and that he had expressed, in Garrett's presence on 2 separate occasions, the opinion that James should not have married someone with no family land of her own. He wrote one final line that was the shortest sentence in the letter, and the most important. "I do not believe Mrs. Bellamy ran from that hearing because she was guilty of what she was accused of. I believe she ran because she understood what she was running from." Nora read the letter twice, the second time more slowly because the first time she was reading for facts, and the second time she was reading the thing underneath the facts, the thing that Thomas Garrett had committed to paper at considerable personal risk. Rufus was still his nearest powerful neighbor. And that said, in the quiet language of a man who expressed himself in actions rather than declarations, that he had seen her clearly and found her worth defending. She set the letter down on the table and looked at it. "Nora," Silas said, "I'm fine." She was. She was also not entirely fine, in the way that being seen accurately by someone who had no obligation to see you that way produces a feeling that doesn't fit neatly into either category. He could have not written. He could have said he didn't remember clearly. He could have. Rufus will make his life difficult for this. Garrett knows that. He wrote it anyway. She folded the letter along its original creases and held it in both hands and thought about a 70-year-old foreman in Kentucky making a decision about what things were worth at the end of a long working life. She thought about what it meant that he'd chosen her side of it. "What does Pike do with this?" she asked. "He's already sent a copy to the Kentucky County Court where the petition was filed. Official correspondence, territorial court to county court, citing new evidence relevant to the pending matter." Silas folded his hands on the table. "And he told me something else. The two local men Rufus signed as character witnesses. Both of them came to Pike last week and withdrew their statements." She looked up. "Why?" "Because Rufus left and stopped paying them." He said it without satisfaction, just as a fact, which was how he said most things. They were hired signatures, not people with opinions. When the income stopped, the opinion stopped. The petition that had sent her running across half a country. The accusation that had been built from a funeral debt and a paid reverend's letter and two strangers' signatures and one man's calculated ambition. It was collapsing, piece by piece, not dramatically, but the way badly built things collapse, quietly, from the foundation, the weight redistributing until nothing was holding the center. "Is it over?" she asked. "Pike thinks the Kentucky court will dismiss the petition within the month. Without local support, without you being a missing party, and with Garrett's letter in the file, there's nothing to argue." He looked at her. "It's over, Nora." She nodded. She sat with that for a moment. Over. The word had a texture she hadn't anticipated, not triumphant, not the sharp, clean feeling of a finish line, but something gentler and more exhausted. The feeling of a person who has been holding a weight for so long that setting it down doesn't produce joy immediately, just the slow, strange awareness of what it felt like not to be carrying it. "I need to go outside for a minute," she said. "All right." She put on her coat and went out into the January afternoon, which was cold and bright, in the particular way of clear winter days. When the snow reflects so much light, the whole world seems to be emanating from itself. She stood in the yard and looked at the hills and breathed the cold air and let the overness of it reach her in increments, the way large things arrive. After a while, she heard the back door open and Silas came and stood beside her. He had Elsie, because Elsie had presumably registered her mother's departure with her usual opinions. Elsie was bundled inside his coat with just her face showing, looking at the hills with the expression of a baby who has recently discovered that outside is a category of place that exists and is still working out how she feels about it. They stood in the yard for a while in the cold and the light and said nothing. That was one of the things she'd learned about him, one of the things she'd come to depend on without having intended to, that he understood when silence was what was needed and didn't fill it out of discomfort. He was just there. Present. She reached over and adjusted Elsie's hat where it had slipped sideways. "Thomas Garrett is going to need a new employer eventually," she said. "If Rufus makes his situation uncomfortable. Kentucky's a long way to recruit from. He knows land, he knows cattle, some, and he's honest." She looked at the hills. "I'm just saying." "I heard what you were saying." Elsie made a sound that was becoming, over the past weeks, more clearly intentional. A particular vocalization she produced when she wanted to redirect adult attention to herself as a matter of some urgency. Silas adjusted his coat around her. She settled. "We should go in," he said. "She's going to get cold." "A minute more." He stayed. The hills were the blue-white of deep winter shadows on snow. The barn was solid and weathered and contained a foal named May, who had come into the world the wrong way around and survived it. The house behind them had smoke rising from the chimney, the fire she'd banked before going to get the letter, still doing its work. She had been in this yard for the first time 2 months ago, soaked through and watching for exits and carrying her daughter and measuring the man who stood in the rain, asking her if she wanted to come inside. She had stood in this same yard 3 weeks ago and looked at Rufus Bellamy across the cold air and not looked away. She was standing in it now, with a letter in her coat pocket that said the case against her was falling apart, and a man beside her who had stood at her shoulder through all of it, without once making her feel like she owed him for the standing. "All right," she said, "let's go in." They went inside, out of the cold, into the warm and ordinary noise of a house where people lived, eat. The formal dismissal arrived from the Kentucky County Court in February, folded inside an official envelope addressed to Justice Harlan Pike, with a courtesy copy directed to Nora Renford, Montana Territory. Pike had it delivered by messenger rather than waiting for the next time someone from the ranch came to Red Willow, which Nora thought was either very efficient or very kind, and probably both, since efficiency and kindness in Harlan Pike tended to operate as the same impulse. She opened it at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning while Silas was in the barn. The language was legal and dry and took 3 paragraphs to say what could have been said in 3 sentences, which was that the petition filed by Rufus Aaron Bellamy regarding the matter of minor child. Elsie Ann Bellamy had been reviewed in light of new information, including testimony submitted by Thomas Emmett Garrett, previously employed by the Bellamy estate, and had been found insufficient to proceed and was hereby dismissed without prejudice to any future legitimate claim that could be properly evidenced and supported. Without prejudice meant Rufus could try again. She read that part twice. The lawyer who had cost her mother's necklace had used that phrase in conversation with her and explained that in practice it meant the door wasn't locked, just closed, and that a man with Rufus's resources could in theory return with better evidence if he found any. She set the letter down and thought about that. Then she thought about Thomas Garrett's precise handwriting, about the account books that documented 4 years of sound financial management, about the will her husband had written clearly and legally before he died, about the fact that Rufus had already shown his hand in Montana, had already demonstrated, in front of a territorial court record, and 2 withdrawn witness statements and a departed man in his empty boarding house room, what his argument was made of. Evidence could work in 2 directions. If Rufus came back, she would be ready for him. That was different from running, profoundly, materially different. She folded the letter and went to the barn. Silas was with May, checking the foal's legs. She'd been favoring her left foreleg slightly, and he'd been monitoring it for a week. He looked up when Nora came in, read her expression, and stood up. She handed him the letter without speaking. He read it. She watched his face as he read it, the slight changes that moved through it, too small for a stranger to track, but legible to her now, after 2 months of steady attention. The specific stillness that was his version of relief, the small release around his eyes. He folded it and held it back out to her. "Without prejudice," she said. "I read that. He could come back." "He could." He looked at her. "Will he?" She thought about Rufus's face on the Red Willow Street, the recalibration, the practical man's arithmetic. "No," she said finally. "Not if I'm watching. Not if the ground keeps shifting." She paused. "Not if we make sure there's nothing left to argue." He tilted his head slightly. A question. "I want to write to the land office in Kentucky," she said, "about Elsie's inheritance, the property my husband left her in trust. I want to make sure the documentation is complete and registered properly, and that Rufus's name is nowhere on it except as the man who tried to take it." She felt the firmness of the sentence as she said it. "I want him to understand that not only did he not get what he came for, he made the record clearer for Elsie by trying." Silas was quiet for a moment. "You'll need a lawyer for that," he said. "A Kentucky lawyer, someone who can work with the local land records." "I know. I've been thinking about who. There was a man in Lexington. I saw his name in the courthouse when I was filing the original estate paperwork. I didn't have money to hire him then." She paused. "We might now, if the supplier renegotiations came through." "They came through." He said it with the brief satisfaction of a man who had signed those letters himself and was aware of what they'd cost and what they'd saved. "We can cover it," she nodded. May shifted in her stall and bumped her nose against Silas's shoulder, and he put a hand up without looking, the automatic gesture of long familiarity, and May accepted it as her due. "Her leg's better," he said. "I know. I've been watching her." "You watch everything." "Someone has to." She looked at him. "You watch things too. You just watch them while pretending you're doing something else." He considered this. "That's probably accurate." She almost smiled. The actual smile was getting easier, she'd noticed, showing up more quickly and with less effort, as though the muscles of it were getting practice. "I'm going to write the letters today," she said, "to the land office and to the Lexington lawyer. I'll look at the accounts tonight and tell you what we can put toward the legal fees." She turned to go back to the house. Then she stopped. "Silas." "What you said. On the ride back from Red Willow, that I shouldn't stay because I was running from something or because I owed you anything." She turned to look at him. "I want you to know that I'm not." He looked back at her with the particular directness that was simply the way he looked at things he was sure about. "I know," he said. "I want you to know that I know you know," she said. "There's a difference." "Is there?" "Yes. One is you trusting me. The other is me telling you that your trust is accurate." She held his eyes. "Both matter." He was quiet for a moment. May nudged his shoulder again, and he didn't move. He just looked at Nora, with the open and exposed expression she saw on him rarely, and that she had come to understand was not softness, but something more durable than softness, the specific look of a man letting himself be seen. "Both matter," he said. She went back to the house. She sat at the table and pulled out paper and ink and began the letter to the Lexington land office, writing in the clear, careful hand she'd developed over 4 years of bookkeeping. And Elsie slept in the cradle by the fire with the green-gray cap still on her head from the morning, and outside the February light came through the window at the low winter angle that meant the season was already, almost imperceptibly, beginning to change. The petition was dismissed. The witnesses were gone. Rufus was east and getting further. And Nora Renford sat in her kitchen and wrote a letter that was not running from anything. She was building something instead. And it turned out those were very different activities, requiring very different hands. She wrote for an hour without stopping, until she had said everything the lawyer would need, and then she signed her name and folded the paper and set it with the letter from Kentucky, and she was done. For now. There would be more to do. There was always more to do. But for this moment, on this Tuesday in February, in a house that had been empty for 3 years and was empty no longer, it was enough. Spring came to the Montana hills the way it always did. Not all at once, not as an announcement, but as a gradual accumulation of evidence. A week of slightly less cold. The south-facing slopes losing their snow first, the dark earth showing through in patches. May testing the fence line with new energy, her winter coat coming loose in tufts that caught on the posts. Elsie, now 8 months old, pulling herself upright by gripping the side of the cradle and looking around the room with the expression of someone who has recently discovered that vertical is an option and intends to pursue it aggressively. The lawyer in Lexington wrote back in March. His name was Aldous Pruitt, and his letter was careful and professional and contained, between its formal sentences, the impression of a man who had looked at the documents Nora sent and understood immediately what had been attempted and had his own opinions about it. He confirmed that the estate documentation was sound, that James Bellamy's will had been properly filed and witnessed, and that the land held in trust for Elsie Ann Bellamy was a matter of clear legal record. He noted that Rufus Bellamy had made 2 inquiries at the county land office in the months following James's death, both of which had been denied on procedural grounds, and that there was no current action pending against the estate. He also noted, in the second-to-last paragraph, that Thomas Garrett had recently approached his office directly and provided a sworn affidavit regarding the nature of Rufus Bellamy's conduct in the months following his brother's death. Garrett had done this without being asked, without being paid, and had walked into the office on his own initiative and asked to be put on the record. Nora read that paragraph 3 times. She wrote Garrett a letter that evening. Not long. Not elaborate. She was not built for elaborate, and she thought he wasn't either, and she thought he would find elaborate condescending after what he'd done. She wrote that she had received the news from Pruitt and that she understood what it had cost him to go on record, and that she was grateful in a way that the word grateful wasn't quite large enough to hold. She wrote that she hoped his situation with Rufus had not become difficult as a result. She wrote that if it ever did, there might be work in Montana for a man who knew land and cattle and kept his word, and that she meant that as a real offer and not a polite one. She signed it Nora Renford and addressed it to Thomas Garrett, Bellamy Farm, Caldwell County, Kentucky, and folded it with the particular care she reserved for things she wanted to arrive intact. Silas read the Pruitt letter when he came in that evening. He read it the way he read everything, without rushing, without commentary, reaching the end before forming a response. It's done, he said. It's done. She was at the stove, and she set it to the pot she was stirring rather than to him, and then she said it again, differently, turning around. It's done. He looked at her across the kitchen. She had the wooden spoon in her hand and her hair was coming loose from where she'd pinned it, and there was something on her sleeve that was probably Elsie's doing. He looked at her the way he'd been looking at her more frequently lately, not differently than before, but more openly, as though some interior door that had been open an inch for months had recently been pushed the rest of the way. Write to Prewitt next week, he said, about the trust documentation for Elsie. I want her name on the Kentucky land record properly, so there's no ambiguity when she's old enough. I was already going to do that. I know, I'm saying I want it too. A pause. It's her inheritance. It should be locked down clean while we're doing the work. Elsie, who was on the floor engaged in an extended physical negotiation with a wooden spoon of her own, Silas had given her the old one from the hook by the stove sometime in February, and she had accepted it as a serious personal possession. Looked up at the sound of her name with the alert, evaluating expression she now wore consistently, as though she was always in the middle of assessing something important, and preferred not to be interrupted, but would allow it briefly. Nora looked at her daughter. 8 months old and sturdy and opinionated and utterly unaware of the amount of energy that had been spent in the past 5 months, ensuring that she would grow up in a house where she was wanted and in a life that belonged to her. She went back to stirring and did not say anything that would embarrass either of them. The spring herd count came in better than expected. This was largely because of the changes Nora had made to the supplier contracts over the winter, which had reduced the cost of winter feeding enough that Silas had been able to keep a larger portion of the previous year's calves through the cold months. He'd resisted this plan initially, not because he disagreed with the math, but because he'd been running the ranch on minimal reinvestment for 3 years, and the habit of caution had calcified into something that looked like strategy, but was actually closer to the financial equivalent of not wanting anything enough to risk losing it. Nora had pointed this out in February, plainly and without softening it, and he'd been annoyed for approximately 1 day and had then started doing what she suggested. By April, the numbers were the best the Renford Ranch had produced in 6 years, which Silas knew because he'd gone back through the older ledgers, the ones from before, the ones with his wife's handwriting in the margins on certain pages, the neat feminine script that still lived in the back of the original book under the cover, and compared them. He mentioned this to Nora on a Tuesday afternoon. Not the numbers specifically, the ledgers. I looked at the old books, he said, to compare the feed costs. She looked up from the correspondence she was drafting. And? Catherine kept the accounts too. He said his wife's name the way he'd started saying it. Not easily, not without cost, but without the specific avoidance that had been there before. Like a door used regularly, the hinge working properly again. She was good at it, different method than you, but good. Nora set down her pen. Was it strange? Looking at them? Yes, he considered. Also not as bad as I expected. He turned his coffee cup. I've been expecting things to be worse than they are lately. I think I got used to that. She understood what he was saying. She'd had her own version of it, bracing for Rufus's next move long after the moves had stopped coming, constructing worst cases as a habit that had outlived its purpose. The body learning that safety was permitted took longer than the mind, sometimes considerably longer. Catherine would have hated the Henderson contract, she said. He looked at her, surprised. From what you've told me, she had strong opinions about what was fair. A slow exhale. She did. Something in his face. She would have told Henderson directly. She wasn't... A pause. She didn't have your patience for working through numbers to make the argument. She just argued. That's a faster method. It is. It burned a few bridges. The corner of his mouth. She didn't always mind. It sounds like she knew what was worth being difficult about. She did. He looked at the table. So do you. Differently, but yes. Nora picked up her pen again. I'm glad you told me her name, she said quietly. Not making an occasion of it, just saying it. I should have said it sooner, he said. You said it when you were ready. She returned to her letter. That's soon enough. He was quiet for a moment. Then he went back to the accounts, and the afternoon settled around them the way it did now. Not the strained quiet of two people performing ease, but the real thing. built from months of small, honest moments accumulated into something that held weight. Thomas Garrett arrived in June. He came by stage to Red Willow and walked the 7 miles to the ranch because the stage didn't go further, which Nora learned when Silas came in on a Thursday morning and said there was a man at the gate who was old and had a bag and had asked for Mrs. Renford specifically. She went to the gate and found him, just as she remembered, leather-faced and economical, standing with his bag at his feet in the dust of the summer road as though he had all the time in the world, which perhaps now he did. "Thomas," she said. "Mrs. Renford." He looked at the ranch behind her. "It's a decent spread. Come see it properly." She brought him inside and fed him and let him rest, and over the course of a long afternoon she learned what had happened in Kentucky since February. Rufus, once it became clear that the Montana petition had collapsed and Garrett had gone on record, had made Garrett's remaining time on the property uncomfortable in the specific, deniable way of powerful men who can't do anything actionable but can make plain that a situation has become adversarial. Garrett had stayed until the spring work was done because the spring work needed doing, and he was a man who finished what he started. Then he had come west. "You said it was a real offer," he said. "I meant it as one." He looked at Silas. Silas looked back at him with the even assessment of a man evaluating a potential hire who has already been told something useful about the person's character from someone he trusted. "I'm 71, Garrett said. "I'm not slower than I look, but I don't look fast." "I need someone who knows cattle and keeps an accurate head count," Silas said. "Not someone who runs." Garrett nodded. "Then we should talk about what you're paying." They talked about it for 40 minutes, at the kitchen table with Nora present and contributing, which Garrett accepted without remarking on in a way that told her he had always known what the actual power arrangement in a well-run household looked like. They arrived at a number. Garrett shook Silas's hand, and then Nora's, and that was that. Silas converted the small room off the barn into something livable over the following week. Not luxurious, but warm and solid, the kind of space built by someone who had decided it should last. Garrett moved in with his bag and a box of books and a photograph Nora didn't ask about, and he started work the following Monday and was, by the second week, indispensable in the specific way of people who have been doing a thing for long enough that their knowledge of it lives in the hands as much as the head. It was Garrett who noticed first, or who said something first, which was his way. It was a July evening and Nora had gone inside early from the yard where she'd been watching Elsie try to walk. An enterprise Elsie had been pursuing with mounting intensity and impressive frustration for 2 weeks. And Garrett was mending a piece of fence nearby, and Silas was nearby, and the old man said, without looking up from his work, "Your wife's been tired in the mornings." Silas looked at him. "People are tired in the mornings." "She's been tired in the mornings for about 3 weeks, Garrett said, "and she went inside 20 minutes ago instead of watching Elsie walk, which she hasn't done before." He pulled a wire tight. "I'm just saying." Silas went inside. Nora was at the kitchen table with a cup of tea she wasn't drinking, looking at the wall in the manner of a person who is thinking about something that has structure. He sat down across from her. He didn't ask immediately. He'd learned from months of living with her that the direct approach was usually best, but that sometimes she needed a moment to find the sentence first. After a minute, she said, "I think I might be expecting." The kitchen was very quiet. "You think?" he said carefully. "I'm fairly certain." She looked at him. "I wanted to be sure before I said anything. I've been waiting to be sure." He looked at her face. She was watching him with an expression he recognized as one of her honest ones, the ones where she wasn't performing a reaction, but showing him an actual interior state, which she still didn't do without some deliberate choice. Underneath the careful steadiness, there was something open and uncertain and waiting, the particular vulnerability of someone who has handed a person something important and is watching to see how it's received. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, the way he had once before, that brief, warm, specific gesture. This time, he didn't take it away. "Nora," he said. "I know it's—" She started. "Nora." He said it again, more simply. Just her name, carrying the weight of everything the name had come to mean over 8 months of a shared table and a shared house and a life that was both more complicated and more real than either of them had expected. She stopped talking. "I'm glad," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned her hand under his and held on, and they sat like that in the kitchen while outside the summer evening settled over the Montana hills, warm and long and unhurried, the way summer evenings were when you had somewhere to be and were already there. Elsie took her first real steps in August, on a Tuesday afternoon, in the direction of May. The foal, who was not precisely a foal anymore at 10 months, all long legs and quiet temperament, and an apparent belief that Elsie was a small, important creature who deserved close attention, was in the paddock near the house, and Elsie had been watching her through the fence with the focused intensity she applied to things that interested her deeply. Then she let go of the fence post, took 4 unsteady, deliberate steps across the open ground, and landed both hands on May's nose with the triumphant certainty of someone who has arrived exactly where they intended. Silas saw it from 20 feet away. He didn't make a sound. He just stood still and watched the baby girl, who had arrived at his gate in a rainstorm at 4 months old, small and unnamed to him and belonging to a woman he hadn't met yet, stand on her own 2 feet for the first time in a life that was already, despite everything that had been thrown at it, entirely and inarguably hers. Nora had seen it too, from the doorway. She came to stand beside him and didn't say anything for a moment. Elsie was patting May's nose with both hands, very pleased with herself, and May was accepting this with the dignity she brought to most things. "She's going to be a problem," Nora said. "She already is. I mean the walking." She watched her daughter. "She's been determined since she was born. She's going to walk, and then she's going to run, and then she's going to be into everything. Like her mother." She looked at him sideways. "I'm not sure if that's a compliment." "It's an observation. Those are the same thing with you." He didn't disagree. Elsie turned around, found her parents with her eyes, and announced her achievement with a sound that was not quite a word, but had a word's ambition. Nora raised a hand. Silas did the same. Elsie returned to May, satisfied that the important people had been notified. "I got a letter from Prewitt today," Nora said. "The Kentucky land documentation is finalized. Elsie's name is on the trust record as sole beneficiary, 2 witnesses, county sealed." She paused. "Rufus's name appears nowhere except in the notation of the dismissed petition." "Good. There's a copy coming by post for our files." She kept her eyes on Elsie. "She'll have 300 acres of Kentucky land when she's 21. Good land, her father's land." A pause. "She can decide what to do with it herself. She might want to keep it. She might want to sell it and do something we can't imagine yet." Nora's voice carried something in it that was not quite grief and not quite pride, but lived in the neighborhood of both. James would have wanted her to decide herself. He was good about that. He didn't hold on to things tightly. Silas was quiet, in the way that had come to mean he was making room for something she needed space to say. "I don't talk about him enough," she said. "I think I stopped because it seemed inappropriate. After we married, I didn't want you to think I was—" "Nora." He turned to look at her. "He was her father. He was your husband. You're allowed to talk about him." She met his eyes. "You talk about Catherine more now." "You made it easier." She looked back at Elsie, who had sat down in the dirt next to May's feet and appeared to be having a conversation with the ground. "We're strange, you know, this family we've built." "Strange how?" "We've got 2 people we're missing woven into the middle of it. His wife, my husband. And then what we have now, which is real and its own thing." She turned her palms up, a gesture that meant she was working through something out loud. "I used to think loss and love were separate, that you processed one and moved into the other, but it's not like that." "No," Silas said, "it's not. They're just both there, all the time." "Yes." She nodded, as if this confirmed something she'd been working toward for a while. The admission was not sad exactly, or not only sad. It was the kind of honest that takes time to arrive at, the kind you can only reach by living in a thing long enough to understand its actual shape, rather than the shape you expected it to have. "The baby's going to need a room," she said after a moment. The shift was deliberate, back to the practical, which was where she lived when feelings had been said as far as they could be said. "I've been thinking about that. The storage room on the east side could be converted. It's got a window. It'll need insulation before winter. Garrett can help with that. He's built more than he lets on." "Of course he has." She almost smiled. "Have you told him yet? About the baby?" "No." "He already knows." Silas looked at her. He said something to me in July. About you being tired. He said something to me in June. She did smile then, the real one. He's been watching since before I was sure myself. He's been watching everything his whole life. Silas looked toward the barn, the small room with its warm lamp visible in the early evening. It's what he does. It's what you do too, she said, just differently. He looked at her. She looked back. The summer evening was going golden now, the light that angle that turned the hills into something that looked painted but was just real in the way things are at the end of a good day. Elsie had given up on the ground and was attempting to stand up again, using May's leg as a support, which May tolerated with the patience of an animal that has simply decided this person is acceptable. This was the family. This specific, imperfect, loss-carrying, forward-moving, argument-having, account-correcting, letter-writing, fence-mending family. With a Kentucky land document in the files and a room to insulate before winter and a foal named after a stubborn woman who had died before she could be known, and a baby coming who would arrive into a house that had been empty and was now full to its edges with the ordinary and extraordinary work of people choosing to be in the same place on purpose. The cradle was still in the front room when November came again. It had been moved twice, once when Elsie outgrew it and needed a proper bed, which Silas built in the East Room over 3 evenings in September, while Garrett held the lantern and expressed opinions about joinery, and once when Nora had suggested, quietly, in October, that it might be needed again soon. Silas had carried it from the storage corner where it had been sitting back to the front room himself, without asking for help, and had set it in the same position by the fire where it had been since February. He had stood looking at it for a moment, and Nora had watched him from the hallway and not interrupted. Then he'd gone to wash up for supper, and that had been that. On a quiet evening in November, 1 year and a few weeks after a storm had brought a woman and a baby to the gate of a ranch that was running on minimum investment and had 1 chair at the table, Nora came in from putting Elsie to bed and found Silas in the front room. He was sitting in his chair. He had 1 hand resting on the edge of the cradle. He wasn't doing anything with the hand, just resting it there, on the wood he'd cut and shaped and sanded in January of a year that had taken everything from him and left him alone in a house full of the shape of what was missing. She came and sat in her chair, across from his, the second chair that had been at the table since the first morning and had never gone back to the wall. And they sat in the warm front room in the quiet that was the best kind of quiet, the kind with people in it. "I've been thinking," Silas said. About the fact that a year ago I hadn't met you." She looked at him. And I don't remember what the point of most of it was." He said it simply, the way he said most true things. "Before. I don't remember what I was doing all of it for." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the November wind was doing its work. The same wind that had been blowing across Montana the night she'd found the road washed out and kept walking anyway because stopping had felt more dangerous than continuing. "Surviving," she said. "You were surviving. That's not the same as living." "No," she said. "It isn't." He looked at the cradle. She looked at it too. The wood was the same. The joinery was the same. The careful hands that had made it, the grief that had lived beside it for 3 years, those were the same too, not erased, not replaced, just held alongside everything that had been added since. "Catherine would have liked you," he said. She held the words for a moment. She had good taste. The corner of his mouth. She did. Nora put her hand over his on the cradle rail, the way he had put his over hers at the table in February when she'd told him about the baby. And they sat like that while the fire burned and the wind moved outside and the house breathed around them, full in all the ways a house can be full. This was the thing she had not been able to imagine 6 months ago, when she was watching the road and telling herself she was only buying time and that staying was not the same as choosing. But she had been wrong about that. Staying, done honestly, with eyes open and losses acknowledged, and the future uncertain and the present imperfect and the other person fully, complicatedly known, staying was precisely the same as choosing. Maybe it was the bravest version of it. She had crossed half a country refusing to let anyone take her daughter. She had stood in a yard in November and looked a dangerous man in the face and not looked away. She had survived a winter and built a household and mended what was broken and written letters to lawyers and kept accounts and named a foal and learned the sound of a man's boots on a floorboard and what his silences meant and how he looked at things he was sure about. All of that had taken courage. But the choosing, the actual, quiet, irreversible choosing to be here, to put her name beside his on a register, and her hand in his on a cradle rail, and her future into the same uncertain space as his, that had taken something else. Something she hadn't known she had until she used it. Not fearlessness. She had not been fearless. She had been afraid every step. Just willing. Willing to stop long enough to find out what was worth stopping for. Elsie would grow up knowing her father's land was hers. She would grow up with a man who had carved her a name onto a foal in November and held her through a fever at 2 a.m. and carried her around a room in slow, uneven circles until she stopped crying and slept. She would grow up in a house where loss was not hidden and love was not performed, and the people around her were honestly, stubbornly, imperfectly trying. That was not a small inheritance. The fire settled into its coals. Silas's hand was warm under hers. The cradle waited, the way it had always waited, for whatever came next. Outside, the